The kitchen is quiet at this hour. Coffee steams in a porcelain cup that has never once been chipped, and the soap on the windowsill smells faintly of lavender, worn thin from years of the same hands reaching for it. Somewhere on the second floor a radio murmurs low, a voice reading the morning news to no one in particular. A woman sits at a writing desk near the window, a stack of cream-coloured envelopes squared in front of her. She addresses them one by one, in a hand that was taught by governesses and has not changed in 30 years. Her name is written on the return address. Her husband's name is written on the household stationery above it. 2 names, 1 roof, and a distance between them that no envelope has ever measured. Outside, the street is still holding on to sleep. A milk truck idles 2 doors down. The light through the curtains is the pale grey of the early morning, not yet decided on the day it will become. This is a story about women who are married in every legal sense and absent in every other one. Women who existed on paper, in ledgers, on the backs of photographs no one looked at twice. Let yourself settle into their world slowly. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. You are standing in a dressing room on the second floor of a townhouse on the Upper East Side, and the dress weighs more than you expected. 40 yards of silk fail, a train that 3 women must lift and settle, a veil pinned so precisely into your hair that you can feel each pin as a small, cool point against your scalp. Downstairs, 200 guests are arranging themselves into pews according to a seating chart drawn up by lawyers as much as by hostesses. This is 1911, and the woman in the mirror is 22 years old. Her name, in a few hours, will change on every document that matters. Bank ledgers, hotel registries, the engraved cards left on silver trays in other people's front halls. She has met the groom 11 times. She has been alone with him twice, both occasions chaperoned from an adjoining room by an aunt who left the door open exactly 4 inches. The marriage being arranged this morning is not, strictly speaking, between 2 people. It is between 2 fortunes. Her family holds shipping interests dating back 3 generations, respectable, but no longer glittering, the kind of old money that has begun, quietly, to thin. His family holds railroad stock and a name that opens doors hers cannot. Between them, lawyers have spent 4 months drafting a settlement that will outlast whatever affection either party might eventually feel. This was, in its era, an entirely ordinary arrangement. Marriages among families of significant wealth were rarely love matches in the way later generations would come to expect them. They were mergers, negotiated the way a shipping company might negotiate with a railroad, each side bringing assets, each side protecting them, each side signing documents that specified, in careful legal language, what would happen to money and property should the marriage ever end. The settlement drawn up before this particular wedding ran to 11 pages. It specified her dowry, held in trust and administered by trustees rather than by her or her husband directly. It specified an allowance, to be paid quarterly, regardless of the state of the marriage itself. It specified what would happen to any children, whose custody under the law of the time would belong almost entirely to the father should the couple ever separate. Nowhere in the 11 pages did the document mention love, or happiness, or even basic compatibility. These were not oversights. They were simply not the kind of thing a marriage settlement was designed to address. The document existed to protect capital. The people signing it were, in the language of their own families, assets being properly deployed. Downstairs, an organ begins the processional. The woman in the mirror takes one last look, not at her face, but at the dress, at the weight of silk that represents in its way everything her family has invested in this single morning. She has been raised, from childhood, to understand that this day was always coming. Governesses taught her French and piano not for her own pleasure, but because a certain kind of husband would expect a certain kind of wife. The groom waits at the altar in a morning coat tailored in London. He is 28, handsome in the unremarkable way of men who have never needed to develop a personality to be found attractive. He has met the bride 11 times as well. He knows slightly more about her dowry than about her temperament. This too was considered unremarkable. Men of his class married the way they invested, carefully, strategically, with an eye toward what a match would consolidate rather than what it might feel like from the inside. The ceremony itself lasts 22 minutes. Vows are exchanged in the old language, the kind that speaks of cherishing and obeying without either party pausing to consider whether the words apply to the transaction actually taking place. A ring is placed on a finger. A kiss is exchanged, brief and formal, the kind performed for an audience rather than felt for its own sake. What almost no one in the church that morning could have predicted, though many might privately have suspected, was how quickly the marriage would settle into its true shape. Within the first year, the couple would establish separate bedrooms, not unusual among their set, where the architecture of large houses was built specifically to accommodate spouses who preferred not to share a room. Within 3 years, the husband would begin spending increasing stretches of time at the family's hunting lodge upstate, ostensibly for sport. The wife would remain in the city townhouse, running a household that, on paper, still belonged to a marriage. She hosted dinners. She sat for the annual family photograph. She wrote letters addressed from the family's return address, using stationery embossed with both their initials intertwined. From the outside, nothing about the arrangement looked unusual. This was, after all, simply how a certain kind of marriage was conducted. It is worth pausing here to understand what marriage actually meant, legally, for a woman of this class and era. Divorce existed, but it was catastrophic, not merely difficult to obtain, but ruinous to pursue. In most states, the only recognized grounds were adultery, and proving it meant airing precisely the kind of scandal a family spent generations trying to avoid. A woman who sued for divorce was, in the eyes of her own social world, advertising her own failure, regardless of whose behaviour had actually caused it. So couples who found themselves incompatible, or who discovered, as this couple would, that the person on the other side of the marriage settlement was someone they could not imagine sharing a life with, rarely divorced. They separated instead, quietly, through private arrangements that left the legal fact of the marriage intact, while dismantling almost everything else about it. The paper remained. The rest dissolved slowly, over years, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. This particular wife did not yet know, in her first year of marriage, what shape her life would eventually take. She knew only that her husband's absences were growing longer, that his letters home had become briefer and more formal, that the warmth she had hoped might grow between two people who saw each other regularly had not arrived, and did not seem to be coming. She filled the growing silence with the occupations available to a woman of her position. She oversaw the renovation of a summer cottage in Newport. She sat on the board of a hospital auxiliary, the kind of charitable work considered appropriate for women whose husbands did not require them at home. She corresponded with cousins in Boston and Philadelphia, women who occupied similar positions in similar marriages, though none of them yet used the word to describe what was happening. There is a particular quality to the letters women in her position wrote to one another during this period. They are warm, detailed, full of news about children and dinners and the weather in whatever resort town they happen to be visiting, and they are, almost without exception, careful never to ask the one question that mattered most. How is your marriage? Nobody asked it directly. Everyone understood eventually what the silences meant. By the time the second wedding anniversary arrived, the household had settled into a rhythm that would define the rest of the marriage. The husband appeared for perhaps 6 weeks a year. Christmas, a portion of the summer season, occasional business obligations that required a public appearance beside his wife. The rest of the year belonged to her alone, in a house too large for one person, staffed by servants who had learned not to ask where the master of the house currently was. The anniversary itself was marked with a dinner for 12, catered by the same firm that had done the wedding 2 years earlier. The husband attended. He gave a toast that mentioned nothing personal, gratitude for the guests, a joke about the wine, a brief nod toward his wife that the room interpreted as affection, and she understood, privately, as performance. The guests left, believing they had witnessed a happy marriage. In a sense, they had. They had witnessed exactly what the marriage was designed to produce. What makes this story worth telling is not that it was unusual. It is that it was common enough to have its own quiet vocabulary among the women who lived it, its own unspoken etiquette, its own rules for what could be discussed and what had to remain unsaid. The wedding day itself, with its silk and its organ music and its 11-page settlement, was never really a beginning in the way weddings are supposed to be. It was a ratification, a signature on an arrangement that had already been decided months earlier by people who were not in the room. The dress from that morning was preserved, as such dresses were, in tissue paper in a cedar closet on the 3rd floor of the townhouse. It would remain there for decades, taken out occasionally and looked at, a physical reminder of a day that had promised one kind of life and delivered another. The woman who wore it would grow old in that same house. She would host holidays, manage staff, answer to a name that was legally, permanently, undeniably her own, and she would do almost all of it alone. None of this happened suddenly. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about marriages like this one. There was no single betrayal, no dramatic confrontation, no moment where the wife looked at her husband and understood all at once what her life had become. It arrived instead the way winter arrives, gradually through 100 small mornings that were each slightly colder than the one before, until one day the frost was simply there, permanent, and no one could quite say when it had settled. In the years that followed, she would come to understand her own wedding day differently than she had experienced it, not as the start of a partnership, but as the final formal step in a transaction between families, a transaction that had, in its own terms, succeeded completely. The fortunes had merged, the name had been secured, the dowry had done its work. Whether the two people at the centre of it ever found any warmth toward one another was, from the perspective of the settlement, entirely beside the point. There is a photograph from that wedding day that survives, framed in what would eventually become her private sitting room. In it she is smiling, not performing a smile, but genuinely smiling, the way a young woman smiles when she does not yet know what her life will require of her. It is, in its way, the most honest image ever taken of that particular morning, precisely because it captures a hope that the rest of the marriage would slowly, quietly, and without a single dramatic scene, fail to fulfill. The pins in her veil that morning left small indentations in her scalp that lasted through the reception and into the evening. She would remember, decades later, that faint pressure more clearly than she remembered most of what was said to her that day. Toasts, blessings, the murmured congratulations of relatives who had travelled from 3 states to watch 2 families complete a transaction dressed up for one afternoon as love. By the time the last guest departed that evening, the newlyweds had already begun occupying separate rooms in the townhouse, a practical matter attributed that first night to the bride's exhaustion after such a long day. No one in the house thought anything of it. Such arrangements were common enough among couples of their standing that a single night apart carried no particular meaning. It was only in hindsight, years later, that the pattern established that evening would come to look less like practicality and more like prophecy. The settlement papers themselves outlived the warmth of the wedding day by decades. They sat in a lawyer's vault on Wall Street, renewed and amended twice over the following years as circumstances shifted, as trustees changed, as the precise language around allowances and dowries was quietly updated to reflect a marriage that both parties now understood, without ever saying so aloud, would never resemble the one imagined on the invitations. What remained, through all of it, was the paper. The marriage certificate filed with the city, the settlement filed with the lawyers, the household stationery still printed with both their names entwined, still used for correspondence long after the correspondence between them had all but ceased. Paper does not require warmth to remain valid. It only requires ink and time, and no one troubling to tear it up. As the light outside the townhouse windows shifts from morning toward afternoon on the day after the wedding, the new bride begins, without quite realizing it, the long process of learning what her marriage actually is. Not a partnership, not, in any way she had imagined as a girl, a love story, a legal fact, sturdy and permanent, that would define the shape of the rest of her life regardless of what did or did not happen inside it. To understand how ordinary this arrangement truly was, it helps to step back from any single wedding and look instead at the broader pattern among families of significant fortune during this period. Marriage, among the old money families of the eastern seaboard, functioned less like a private romantic decision and more like a formal instrument of estate planning. Sons and daughters were, in the frank language some parents use privately, assets to be positioned advantageously. Matchmaking of this kind was conducted through channels that resembled business negotiation more than courtship. Mothers exchanged information about eligible families the way brokers exchanged information about stock. A daughter's dowry was discussed with the same careful arithmetic as a merger. A son's prospects were weighed against what family he might marry into, what name might attach itself to the family ledger, what connections might open in banking or shipping or rail. The young people at the centre of these arrangements were rarely given veto power in any meaningful sense. They might object to a particular match, and occasionally such objections were honoured, but the underlying premise that marriage existed to consolidate and protect family fortune was almost never questioned. It was simply the water in which they swam, invisible because it was everywhere. Legal instruments evolved to formalise this understanding. Marriage settlements, drawn up by attorneys who specialised in exactly this kind of document, specified with precision what belonged to whom, what would happen to that property in the event of death, and, increasingly, as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, what would happen in the event of separation, a possibility that lawyers had begun to plan for even as clergy still spoke the old vows about permanence. This planning was not cynicism so much as realism. Attorneys who worked among wealthy families understood that a meaningful percentage of the marriages they helped arrange would not remain warm for long. They drafted documents accordingly, less as an admission of failure than as ordinary prudence, the same prudence that led families to insure a house against fire even while hoping it would never burn. The particular bride whose wedding day opened this chapter was, in this sense, entirely representative of thousands of women in her position. Records and society columns from the period are full of couples who appear, on paper, married and prosperous, and who in practice occupied separate residences for the majority of the year, meeting only for the handful of occasions that required a unified public appearance. Newport, Rhode Island, offers a particularly vivid illustration of the pattern. The great summer cottages built along the cliffs during this era were, in many cases, occupied primarily by wives and children, with husbands appearing for a fortnight in August before returning to business in the city, business that, for a certain number of these men, included a second life that never appeared in any ledger their wives were permitted to see. Society columns of the period developed an entire vocabulary for describing these arrangements without naming them directly. A husband was described as detained by business. A wife was described as opening the cottage early this season. Readers who moved in these circles understood exactly what such phrases meant, the way a modern reader understands the coded language of an obituary that omits a cause of death. Everyone knew. No one said it plainly. It is worth sitting, for a moment, with what this meant for the women living inside these arrangements. They were not abandoned in any legal sense. Their names remained on deeds, their allowances continued to arrive, their positions in society remained technically unchanged. And yet the daily texture of their lives was one of profound solitude, dressed in silk and served by staff, but solitude nonetheless. The bride from the opening of this chapter would spend the coming decade learning to inhabit that solitude gracefully. She would become known, among her circle, as an excellent hostess, someone who could arrange a dinner party for 20 with effortless precision. She would sit on committees, support hospitals, involve herself in the kind of charitable work that gave shape and purpose to days that might otherwise have stretched out formless in front of her. None of this, it should be said, made her unhappy in every hour of every day. Solitude of this kind, chosen or not, is rarely a single unbroken note of grief. There were mornings she found genuine pleasure in, the particular quality of light in her sitting room, a letter from a favourite cousin, the small satisfaction of a household run exactly as she wished it. Her life was not a tragedy in every moment. It was, more precisely, a life built around an absence that never quite stopped being felt. The wedding gown, folded into its tissue paper on the third floor, became over the years a kind of private artefact, visited occasionally, rarely discussed, understood by the household staff to be a subject best left alone. When asked, decades later, why she kept it so carefully preserved, she would say only that it had cost a great deal of money and seemed ashamed to discard. This was true. It was also, quite plainly, not the whole truth. By the time a decade had passed since that wedding morning, the pattern of the marriage had calcified into something both parties understood without needing to discuss. He would arrive for Christmas and depart in early January. He would appear again in June, briefly, before the social season demanded his presence at a handful of specific events. Between these visits, the townhouse belonged entirely to her, a fact that neighbours, servants, and even her own family had long since stopped remarking upon. This is the quiet architecture beneath so many of the marriages examined across the rest of this story. Not sudden ruin, not scandal, at least not at first, simply a slow settling, year over year, into an arrangement that satisfied the legal and financial requirements of marriage, while abandoning almost everything else the institution had once promised to provide. In later years, when younger relatives asked her about the early days of the marriage, she would describe the wedding itself in warm general terms: the beauty of the flowers, the excellence of the orchestra, the kindness of a particular aunt who had travelled from Baltimore despite her health. She rarely mentioned the groom directly in these recollections, not out of bitterness exactly, but because there was simply very little to say about a man she had come to know so briefly and so formally. The household ran, in the meantime, with the precision of a small institution. A cook prepared meals for a family that was in practice one woman and whichever relatives happened to be visiting. A butler answered a door that the master of the house rarely walked through. Housemaids turned down a bed in a room that had not been slept in by its intended occupant in years. The staff, for their part, learned to speak of the household's rhythms without ever commenting on what those rhythms revealed. There is a particular kind of discretion that develops among servants in houses like this one. Not ignorance, but a practiced silence, an agreement, unspoken, that certain observations would never be voiced aloud, not to guests, not to each other, and certainly not to the family whose secrets they quietly managed. A good household staff in this era was measured partly by its ability to see everything and repeat nothing. The wife herself became over time remarkably skilled at a particular kind of performance, not deception exactly, but a careful curation of what the outside world was permitted to see. Letters to distant relatives described a full and busy life, which was, in its way, entirely true. Photographs taken at the annual family gathering showed a couple standing appropriately close together, expressions calm and pleasant, the kind of image that could be mailed to relatives in Ohio without raising a single question. What the photographs could not show, and what the letters carefully omitted, was the particular quality of an evening spent entirely alone in a house built for a family of 6. The dining room set for one, the long table an argument for a company that never arrived. The drawing room where she read by lamplight while the rest of the house sat dark and unused, room after empty room, each one dusted weekly by a staff maintaining a household that no longer, in any real sense, existed. It would be a mistake to imagine this life as one of constant suffering. There is a particular resilience that develops in people who learn to build meaning inside constraint rather than waiting for the constraint to lift. She found it, eventually, in her work with the hospital board, in long afternoons spent with her sister's children, in a garden she designed and tended herself, one of the few projects in her life that answered to no one's approval but her own. Still, beneath the busyness, beneath the committees and correspondence and carefully maintained appearances, there remained the simple fact of the marriage itself, a legal bond that structured everything about her life, her name, her income, her standing in society, while providing almost none of the companionship such a bond was traditionally understood to promise. She had signed no document herself that morning in 1911. Her signature was not required, but she would spend the following decades living inside the consequences of what others had signed on her behalf. As this chapter closes and the story moves forward into the years that followed, it is worth remembering the particular stillness of that wedding morning, the pins in the veil, the 11 pages of settlement waiting in a lawyer's office, the organ music beginning downstairs while a young woman looked at her own reflection and did not yet know what shape her life would take. She would learn in time exactly what her marriage was. On that morning she still believed, or wanted to believe, that it might become something else. The office is on the 4th floor of a building on Lower Broadway, reached by an elevator operated by a young man in uniform who has learned, over years of carrying clients to this particular floor, never to ask questions about who they are visiting or why. The hallway is lined with frosted glass doors bearing the names of law firms in gold lettering, each one discreet, each one specializing quietly in exactly this kind of arrangement. A woman sits across a mahogany desk from a lawyer she has never met before this morning, though he has represented her husband's family for 11 years. Beside her, her own attorney, retained by her family rather than her husband's, a small but important distinction, reviews a document that will, once signed, formalize what has been true in practice for nearly 2 years. The marriage will not end. It will simply be arranged, on paper, to require nothing further of either party. This is the deed of separation, an instrument that occupies a strange legal middle ground between a functioning marriage and a formal divorce. It is not divorce. Neither party is free to remarry. The legal fact of the marriage remains fully intact, recorded in the same registries, carrying the same weight in matters of inheritance and legitimacy. What the deed changes is everything else: where each party will live, how much money will change hands, what obligations, if any, remain between them. For families of significant wealth in this era, the deed of separation served a purpose that divorce could not. Divorce required a public court proceeding, a finding of fault, testimony that would inevitably become a matter of public record. A deed of separation, by contrast, could be negotiated entirely in private, between attorneys, signed in an office like this one, filed away without ever appearing in a newspaper or a courtroom transcript. The document being reviewed this particular morning runs to 14 pages, considerably longer than most standard leases or business contracts of the period. It specifies, in careful and unemotional legal language, an annual allowance to be paid to the wife, not from her husband's income directly, but from a trust established for that specific purpose, administered by trustees who report to no one but themselves and the terms of the document itself. The allowance is generous by ordinary standards, sufficient to maintain a household staff and a standard of living consistent with what she enjoyed during the functioning years of the marriage. It is in this sense an act of genuine provision, but it is also, unmistakably, compensation, payment in exchange for her continued silence, her continued willingness to appear when required as his wife, and her continued agreement not to pursue a public divorce that might embarrass either family. There is a clause, 3 pages into the document, addressing what the lawyers refer to delicately as public appearances. The wife agrees to attend a specified number of family functions each year: weddings, funerals, the annual portrait commissioned for the family Christmas card, presenting, on these occasions, as a couple in good standing. In exchange, she is permitted to live entirely separately for the remainder of the year, in a residence of her choosing, without interference or inquiry from her husband or his family. Reading this clause decades later, it can seem almost theatrical in its precision. The idea that a marriage could be reduced to a fixed number of annual performances, each one scheduled and budgeted for like any other social obligation. But at the time, this arrangement represented, for many women, the most practical available solution to a problem the law offered almost no other way to address. The alternative to a private separation was, after all, considerably worse. A woman who sought a formal divorce needed to prove adultery in most jurisdictions of this era, a requirement that put her in the position of hiring investigators, gathering evidence, and eventually testifying, publicly under oath, about the precise and humiliating details of her husband's infidelity. Even a successful case carried enormous social cost. Divorced women, regardless of fault, were treated by polite society as damaged, diminished, no longer quite respectable. A woman who separated privately, by contrast, retained her married name, her position, her invitations to the events that mattered. She was understood within her circle to have an unconventional marriage, a phrase that did significant work, allowing everyone involved to acknowledge the situation without ever naming it directly. She was still, in every social sense that mattered, a wife. The private reality of that status was hers alone to carry. The lawyer across the desk this morning explains the trust structure in careful detail. The allowance will be paid quarterly, on the 1st of January, April, July and October, deposited directly into an account she alone controls. Should her husband die before her, the allowance continues, protected against any claims his estate's other beneficiaries might raise. Should she remarry, an impossibility under the terms of the marriage itself, since she remains legally his wife, the allowance would cease. The clause exists as a formality. Everyone in the room understands it will never apply. There is something almost gentle in how carefully the document anticipates every contingency, as though the lawyers who drafted it understood, better than either party might admit aloud, that this arrangement was likely to last for decades. It specifies what happens to jointly held property. It specifies who retains the family's summer residence and who is granted use of it during which months. It specifies, with what might almost be called tenderness, that either party retains the right to change the arrangement should circumstances shift. Circumstances in practice rarely shifted. Deeds of separation once signed tended to hold for the remaining span of both parties' lives, quietly governing a marriage that existed from that point forward, primarily as a legal and financial fact rather than a lived experience. The wife would return to this same law office perhaps 3 or 4 more times over the following decades, to adjust an allowance for inflation, to address a question of inheritance, to formalise an arrangement regarding a family property, but never again to fundamentally alter the shape of what was decided this morning. The signing itself is almost anticlimactic. 2 fountain pens, a blotter, a witness brought in from an adjoining office who signs beneath both their names without reading a word of what he is witnessing. The wife's attorney checks the document once more, page by page, before sliding it across the desk. Her signature, when it comes, is steady. The same hand that addressed wedding invitations years earlier, now closing a different kind of chapter with the same practiced elegance. Her husband is not present for the signing. This too was common practice. The 2 parties rarely occupied the same room during these negotiations, communicating instead entirely through their respective attorneys, a distance that mirrored, in its way, the distance the document itself was formalising. He would sign his own copy later that week in his own lawyer's office, a transaction handled with the same careful discretion as any other significant business matter. What strikes a modern reader most, encountering documents like this one in archives and estate records, is the sheer administrative thoroughness applied to what was, at its core, a profound personal disappointment. Grief in this world was processed through paperwork. Heartbreak was itemised clause by clause into provisions for property and allowance and the scheduling of appropriate appearances. The emotional reality of the marriage's failure was never once mentioned in 14 pages of careful legal prose. This was, in a sense, the point. The document existed precisely to remove emotion from a situation that could otherwise have become catastrophically messy, for both families, for the fortunes involved, for the social positions each party still needed to maintain. By translating heartbreak into contract law, the lawyers who drafted arrangements like this one offered their clients something valuable, even if it was not comfort exactly. They offered structure. They offered a way forward that did not require either party to publicly admit what had gone wrong. After the signing, the wife's attorney walks her to the elevator, making the kind of small talk lawyers make when a difficult meeting has concluded successfully. He mentions the weather. He asks after her mother's health. He does not mention the document they have just signed, and she does not raise it either. By the time the elevator reaches the ground floor, the conversation has moved entirely to ordinary matters, as though the previous hour had addressed nothing more significant than the sale of a piece of property. In a sense, it had. The marriage, from a legal standpoint, was itself a form of property, an arrangement of names and assets and obligations that could be adjusted, restructured, and formalised through exactly the same instruments used to manage any other significant transaction. The deed of separation did not end a love story because in the strictest legal sense, no love story had ever been required to begin with. It simply adjusted the terms of a contract that had always, from its very first page, been about something other than love. Walking out onto Broadway that afternoon, the wife pauses for a moment on the sidewalk, adjusting her gloves, looking up at the building she has just left. Inside that building, on the 4th floor, a document now exists that will govern the shape of her life for the next 30 years, where she will live, how much money will arrive and when, how many times a year she will be required to stand beside a man she rarely sees, and smile for a photograph that will be mailed to relatives who will never know what the 14 pages behind that photograph actually contain. She hails a cab and gives the driver her address, her own address now, formally, a townhouse purchased with funds specified in the very document she has just signed. The ride home passes quickly. By the time she arrives, the afternoon light has shifted, softened, the particular gold of late afternoon settling over the brownstones of her street. She lets herself in. The house is quiet. It will remain quiet in this particular way for a very long time to come. There is a peculiar comfort, she would later admit to a cousin in a letter, in knowing precisely where she stood. The years of uncertainty, of wondering whether the marriage might yet improve, of hoping for a warmth that never fully arrived, were, in their way, harder to bear than the clarity the document now provided. She knew, walking through her own front door that afternoon, exactly what her life would look like for the foreseeable future. There was something almost restful in that certainty, even as the certainty itself was not what she had once hoped for. The 14 pages would be updated only twice more in the following decades, once when her husband's family trust was restructured following a change in tax law, and once, many years later, following his death, when the allowance clause was quietly retired and replaced by a widow's portion of the estate, negotiated by yet another set of attorneys in yet another office on Lower Broadway. By then, the original document had done its work for nearly 3 decades, governing a marriage that existed almost entirely on paper, in rooms just like the one where it had first been signed. The origins of this particular legal instrument reach back considerably further than any individual marriage examined in this story. Deeds of separation had existed in various forms since well before the 20th century, evolving out of English common law traditions in which a woman's legal identity was, for most practical purposes, absorbed entirely into her husband's upon marriage. A deed of separation, in its earliest forms, required a trustee to act on the wife's behalf, since the law did not, for a long stretch of history, recognise her as capable of contracting on her own account. By the time the arrangement in this chapter was being negotiated, legal reforms had gradually extended more direct rights to married women, the ability, in most states, to hold property and enter contracts in their own name, to control income they had inherited or earned independently of their husbands. These reforms mattered enormously, and they explain why the wife in this story was able to sit at that mahogany desk and sign the document herself, in her own name, rather than through a trustee acting as her intermediary, as her grandmother's generation would have required. Still, the underlying logic of the deed remained largely unchanged from its earlier forms. It existed to manage the practical consequences of a marriage that had failed without requiring either party to formally dissolve it. For women of significant wealth, this middle path offered protections that outright divorce could not. She retained her married name and with it the social standing that name carried. She retained her position as hostess of family occasions, however occasional those occasions became. She retained, crucially, her place within a social world that had very little patience for divorced women, regardless of the circumstances that had led to the divorce. Legal historians examining estate records from this period have found deeds of separation filed quietly alongside wills, trusts, and property transfers, administrative documents indistinguishable on the surface from any other instrument managing a family's wealth across generations. They rarely appear in newspapers, they rarely generate the kind of scandal that a contested divorce might produce. This was, in fact, their entire purpose. A deed of separation was designed to be invisible to everyone outside the small circle of attorneys and family members who negotiated it. The invisibility extended even to close friends. A woman might maintain a correspondence for years with someone she considered an intimate confidant, without ever directly stating that she and her husband lived apart under a formal legal arrangement. The language used in such letters, "My husband is occupied with business, we keep somewhat different schedules these days, the house suits my needs quite well on my own," created a kind of shared code among women of this class, phrases that signalled the truth without ever stating it plainly enough to be repeated as gossip. This code extended into printed materials as well. The social registers published annually in cities like New York and Boston listed married couples by their joint household, regardless of whether that household actually functioned as one. A woman's name might appear beside her husband's at an address he had not slept in for a decade, the printed page preserving a fiction that both parties, and increasingly the publishers themselves, understood to be exactly that. It would be inaccurate to suggest that every woman who entered into a deed of separation experienced the arrangement as pure loss. For some, particularly those whose marriages had involved genuine unhappiness or worse, the deed represented a form of liberation, freedom from a husband's daily presence, freedom to structure a household entirely according to her own preferences, freedom, within the considerable limits still imposed by the era, to live a life that answered primarily to her own judgment rather than his. The financial provisions within these documents, while framed in the cold language of trusts and quarterly payments, often represented the most substantial and reliable income many of these women would ever independently control. Unlike a husband's discretionary generosity, which could fluctuate with his mood or his business fortunes, the allowance specified in a properly drafted deed of separation was a binding legal obligation, enforceable through the same courts that enforced any other contract. In this narrow but important sense, the document offered a form of financial security that the marriage itself, in its earlier and ostensibly happier years, had never actually guaranteed. This did not make the arrangement painless. Whatever security the document provided came at the cost of a marriage that would never be resolved in any final sense. No divorce decree to mark a clean ending, no legal freedom to remarry, no closure beyond the quiet permanence of separate addresses and scheduled appearances. The wife who signed this particular deed would remain, for the rest of her natural life, legally married to a man she saw perhaps 6 times a year, in a status that was neither fully married nor fully free, suspended permanently between the two. As the afternoon settles further into evening on the day of the signing, it is worth returning to the quiet, ordinary details of what such a day actually felt like from the inside. Not the grand sweep of legal and social history, but the particular texture of an ordinary Tuesday in which a woman's entire future was formalized across 14 typed pages. The elevator operator who never asked questions, the frosted glass doors, the fountain pen, slightly heavier than she expected, leaving her signature in dark blue ink at the bottom of a page she had read 3 times but would remember, in later years, mostly as a blur of careful legal language. These are the rooms where so many marriages of this era were quietly reshaped. Not courtrooms, not the offices of clergy, but law firms on the 4th floors of buildings along Broadway and Wall Street, where deeds like this one were drafted, revised, and signed with the same careful attention given to any other significant transaction. The marriages themselves rarely ended in these rooms. They simply changed shape, becoming something quieter, more private, more permanent in their impermanence than either party might have imagined on their wedding day. In the weeks that followed the signing, the wife found herself, almost without intending to, reorganizing her sense of time around the new rhythm the document had established. Quarterly payments arriving on schedule became a kind of anchor, a reminder 4 times a year that the arrangement was still functioning exactly as designed. The handful of required appearances, a summer garden party here, a family funeral there, became fixed points on a calendar, otherwise entirely her own to arrange. She grew, over time, almost fond of the predictability this brought to her life. Where the early years of marriage had been marked by a kind of low, constant uncertainty. Would he be home for dinner? Would this be the season things finally improved? The years following the deed offered something closer to peace. She knew what was expected of her. She knew what she could expect in return. The document, cold as its language was, had replaced hope with clarity. And clarity, it turned out, was easier to live inside. Her attorney would visit twice a year, ostensibly to review the trust's performance, though the meetings gradually became more social than strictly necessary. A cup of tea, an update on mutual acquaintances, a gentle inquiry into whether anything about the arrangement needed adjustment. Nothing ever did. The document had been drafted carefully enough, thoroughly enough, that it required almost no maintenance at all, humming along quietly in the background of her life like a well-built piece of machinery that simply continued doing its job. It is easy, looking back at documents like this one from a considerable historical distance, to focus entirely on what they reveal about the limitations placed on women of this era. The narrow legal paths available to them, the social costs attached to every alternative, the way even a woman of considerable independent wealth still required a husband's cooperation, mediated through attorneys, to formalize the terms of her own daily life. All of this is true and worth sitting with. But it is also worth recognizing what these women built within those limitations. The deed of separation was not, in the end, simply a document of loss. For the woman at the center of this chapter, it became the foundation of a life she then spent the following decades constructing carefully, deliberately on her own terms. A household run exactly as she wished. A calendar filled with obligations she had chosen rather than ones imposed upon her. A solitude that, however unchosen in its origin, she gradually came to inhabit with something resembling contentment. The light in the law office windows had shifted from midday to late afternoon by the time the final signatures were witnessed and notarized that day. Outside, Broadway carried on exactly as it had that morning. Streetcars, newsboys, the ordinary churn of a city entirely indifferent to the quiet reshaping of one woman's future, taking place 4 floors above the sidewalk. She would walk out of that building a different kind of wife than she had been walking in. The change was invisible to everyone she passed. It was in every way that mattered to her own life, complete. The townhouse has 5 floors and 11 rooms, and on any given evening perhaps 2 of them are in use. A sitting room on the 2nd floor where she reads after dinner, a bedroom on the 3rd, hers alone, the adjoining room, once intended for a husband who now visits perhaps 6 weeks a year, kept immaculate and empty, aired weekly by a housemaid who has long since stopped wondering why. There is a particular skill involved in running a household this size for an occupancy of 1, and she has, over the years, become expert in it. A staff of 6 manages the property: a cook, a housemaid, a lady's maid, a butler who doubles as household manager, a gardener who comes 3 days a week, and a driver retained on a part-time basis for the increasingly rare occasions she requires the car. Together, they maintain a residence built for a family considerably larger than the one that actually lives there. The dining room seats 14. On an ordinary evening it is set for 1, though she has instructed the staff more than once to lay the table properly regardless. Full silver, a folded napkin, a single placemat positioned with the same care as if a dozen guests were expected. There is something in this ritual she has never quite been able to explain, even to herself. Perhaps it is a form of self-respect. Perhaps it is simply habit, inherited from a childhood in which meals were never taken any other way. The house was purchased, per the terms of the separation, entirely in her own name, using funds specified in the settlement itself. This detail mattered more than it might first appear. A woman of her era who lived in a residence still owned by her husband occupied, in a sense, a kind of borrowed space. Comfortable, certainly, but always subject, in theory, to a decision that was not hers to make. Owning the house outright gave her something the marriage itself had never fully provided, a space that answered to no one but her. She furnished it slowly over the course of the first 2 years, room by room, according to her own taste rather than any inherited family aesthetic. The result was distinctive in a way that visitors sometimes remarked upon, lighter than the heavy Victorian interiors still favoured by many of her contemporaries, with more attention paid to the quality of morning light in a room than to the impressiveness of its furnishings. It was, in its way, the first home she'd ever truly designed for herself. Mornings followed a rhythm as precise as any factory schedule, though considerably gentler. She woke at 7, took coffee alone in the small breakfast room overlooking the garden, reviewed correspondence and the day's household accounts with her butler at 8:30. By 9 she had usually retreated to her study, a room that had once been intended, according to the original architectural plans, as her husband's, to attend to whatever committee work or correspondence the day required. The staff who ran this household understood their positions came with a particular kind of discretion attached. They served a woman whose married status was, in every legal sense, entirely secure, and whose daily life bore almost no resemblance to what that married status implied. New servants were briefed gently by the more senior staff. The master of the house travelled extensively for business, his schedule was his own affair, and questions on the subject were neither expected nor welcome. This discretion extended to correspondence as well. Letters addressed to the household occasionally arrived for him, forwarded from an address the staff had been instructed never to discuss. The butler handled these matters with the same practised neutrality he brought to every other aspect of the household's operation, placing forwarded mail on a designated tray, never commenting, never asking, treating the entire arrangement as simply one more administrative detail among many. The garden became, over the years, the household's most personal space, the one area of the property that reflected almost nothing of the marriage that had originally funded the house's purchase. She designed it herself, working closely with the gardener over several seasons, favouring the kind of English perennial borders that required patience and attention rather than the more formal, symmetrical plantings fashionable among her neighbours. It was, perhaps, the one part of the property that felt entirely unambiguously hers. Afternoons brought visitors when visitors came, cousins occasionally passing through the city, members of the hospital board, meeting to review quarterly reports over tea in the second-floor sitting room, old school friends, now scattered across various marriages of their own, some considerably happier than hers, some, though this was rarely discussed directly, considerably less so. The house, for these hours, filled with the particular warmth of company, before emptying again by early evening into its more customary quiet. Evenings were by far the most solitary portion of the day. Dinner at 7, taken alone in the dining room built for 14, An hour or two afterward, with a book or correspondence in the sitting room, the fire lit against whatever chill the season brought. By 10, she typically retired, the house settling into the particular silence of a large residence occupied by very few people. Creaks in the floorboards, the distant sound of staff finishing their own evening duties below, the occasional passing carriage or, in later years, automobile on the street outside. It would be inaccurate to describe every evening as lonely in the way that word is typically used. There is a difference between loneliness and solitude, and she had over the years developed a considerable capacity for the latter. She read widely: history, biography, the occasional novel that a friend recommended. She wrote letters that were, by all accounts, warm and detailed and full of genuine interest in the lives of the people she corresponded with. Her solitude was not the solitude of someone waiting for a life that had failed to arrive. It was increasingly simply the shape her life had taken. Still, there were evenings, and she would admit this only rarely, and only to the small handful of people she trusted enough to say it aloud, when the size of the house pressed on her in a particular way. 11 rooms, 6 staff members, a dining table that seated 14, all of it maintained for a household of essentially one person. On these evenings, the careful rituals that structured her days felt less like comfort and more like scaffolding, holding up a life that might otherwise have felt considerably emptier than she generally allowed herself to acknowledge. The household accounts, reviewed monthly with her butler, told their own quiet story. Expenses for entertaining were modest, reflecting a social calendar built around small gatherings rather than the large parties common among couples of similar wealth. Expenses for staff, by contrast, remained substantial and constant, the cost of maintaining a house at a scale that no longer matched the life actually lived inside it. She never seriously considered reducing the household. The staff had, in their own way, become something closer to family than the family she had actually married into. Holidays brought the rare, full occupation of the house. Christmas, in particular, required the dining room to finally serve its intended purpose. Extended family arriving from Boston and Philadelphia, the table set properly for 12 or 14, the house filled, for a handful of days each December, with exactly the kind of warmth its architecture had originally been designed to hold. Her husband typically appeared for a portion of these gatherings, present enough to satisfy the terms of the separation, distant enough that most guests understood, without being told directly, not to ask too many questions about his comings and goings. These holiday gatherings required a particular kind of performance from her, one she had, over the years, grown skilled enough at that few guests ever suspected the effort involved. She and her husband would greet arriving relatives together at the front door, presenting a united picture that dissolved almost immediately once the receiving line ended and guests dispersed into the house's various rooms. By the second day of any such visit, he had typically retreated to his study or departed for meetings that may or may not have actually existed, leaving her, once again, to manage the gathering largely on her own. The children of visiting relatives, too young to understand the particular arrangement governing their aunt's household, sometimes asked innocent questions that the adults around them quickly redirected. Where does Uncle sleep? Why doesn't he come to breakfast? Is he coming back today? She answered these questions with the same practiced warmth she brought to every other aspect of managing appearances, offering explanations vague enough to satisfy a child's curiosity without ever approaching the actual truth of the matter. Winter evenings, once the holiday guests had departed and the house returned to its customary quiet, brought their own particular texture. Snow against the windows, the fire in the sitting room burning low. The staff, having completed their evening duties, retired to their own quarters on the top floor, leaving the rest of the house to her alone. She would sometimes walk through the empty rooms before retiring. The dining room, still smelling faintly of the evening's dinner, the unused parlour, the study that had once been intended for a husband who visited it perhaps a dozen times a year. There is a particular kind of ownership that develops in a person who maintains a large space largely alone. Not merely legal ownership, though she held that too, but a deeper familiarity with every room, every creaking floorboard, every quality of light at every hour of the day. She knew this house more completely than anyone else in her life had ever known it, including the architects who had designed it, and the husband whose name still appeared alongside hers on its deed. By the time a full decade had passed since the house was purchased, its rhythms had become so thoroughly established that visitors sometimes remarked on the particular calm that seemed to fill the place. Not the calm of stillness exactly, but the calm of a household running precisely as intended, every ritual serving its purpose, every room fulfilling its function, even if that function bore little resemblance to what the original architectural plans had imagined for it. It is worth pausing here to consider the practical mathematics of maintaining a household at this scale, because the numbers themselves tell their own quiet story about the economics of separation among families of significant wealth. The annual cost of running the townhouse, staff wages, food, heating, maintenance, the endless small repairs any large residence requires, consumed a substantial portion of the quarterly allowance specified in the deed of separation. She could, in theory, have lived far more modestly on a fraction of that income. She chose not to, and the choice itself reveals something important about what the house had come to represent. The house was not simply shelter. It was proof, tangible and daily, of a status that could not be taken from her regardless of how rarely her husband appeared within its walls. Every room maintained, every staff position filled, every dinner set with proper silver for a table of one, functioned as a quiet assertion that her marriage, however unconventional its daily reality, remained fully legitimate, fully respectable, entirely equal in standing to any marriage conducted along more traditional lines. The house argued, in its own architectural language, that nothing about her position had diminished. This is not to suggest the arrangement was without its private costs. There were mornings, particularly in the earliest years, when she woke in a room built for two and felt, quite acutely, the absence the room's original design had anticipated filling. The adjoining bedroom, kept immaculate for a husband who almost never used it, became for her a kind of quiet monument, not to grief exactly, but to a specific expectation that marriage had once promised, and never, in any sustained way, delivered. She dealt with this absence the way she dealt with most difficulties in her life, through structure, through occupation, through the careful management of her days so thoroughly that there was rarely a stretch of unstructured time long enough for the harder feelings to fully surface. Committee meetings filled her mornings, correspondence filled her afternoons. The garden, in its proper season, filled entire weeks with the kind of physical, absorbing work that left little room for rumination. The staff, for their part, developed over the years a genuine loyalty to her that went beyond ordinary professional obligation. The butler, who had come to the household in its first year and would remain for nearly 3 decades, occasionally allowed himself small gestures of personal care that exceeded strict job description. A fire lit in her study before she had even rung for it, a particular tea prepared without being asked, an awareness of her moods that came only from years of careful, quiet attention. In a household built around her singular presence, the staff became, in their own understated way, something closer to companionship than employment. Seasons brought their own particular rhythms to the house. Spring meant the garden's slow awakening, weeks spent planning that year's plantings with the gardener, correspondence with nurseries about particular varieties of rose or delphinium. Summer meant a partial closing of the house, staff reduced to a skeleton crew while she spent several weeks at the family's property in Newport, another residence, another set of rooms, another version of the same essential solitude, though softened somewhat by the presence of extended family who gathered there each August. Autumn brought the house back to its full winter operation, staff returning from their own summer arrangements, the dining room once again set nightly for a table of one as the days shortened, and the fires in every room were lit earlier each evening. Winter, as already described, brought the holiday gatherings that briefly filled the house with exactly the life its architecture had been designed for, before the departure of relatives returned everything, by early January, to its accustomed quiet. There is a particular photograph from this period that survives among her personal papers, not a formal portrait, but a candid image taken by a visiting niece, showing her seated in the garden on a summer afternoon, a book open but unread in her lap, gazing at something just outside the frame. It is, in its way, one of the more revealing images from this chapter of her life, capturing not tragedy exactly, but a kind of settled, private thoughtfulness that seems entirely at home within the walls and the garden she had built for herself. Visitors to the house sometimes remarked, in letters and diaries that survive from the period, on a particular quality they struggled to name precisely, not sadness and not quite contentment either, but something adjacent to both. One cousin, writing to her own sister after a weekend visit, described the household as peaceful in a way that felt earned rather than simply given, as though its mistress had built, deliberately and over considerable time, a life that could withstand the particular absence at its centre. This is perhaps the most accurate way to understand what a house like this one actually represented. It was not a monument to abandonment, though abandonment, in a narrow legal sense, was never quite what had occurred. It was, more precisely, a structure built and maintained by a woman who had learned to construct meaning and dignity within circumstances she had not chosen and could not, under the laws and customs of her era, fully escape. The 11 rooms, the staff of 6, the dining table set nightly for 14, all of it stood as evidence of a life fully lived, even within the particular and considerable constraints that shaped it. As the years accumulated, the house itself seemed to settle more fully into its true purpose, less a monument to what had been hoped for on her wedding day, and more simply, unmistakably home, hers in every sense that mattered, regardless of whose name appeared alongside her own on the original deed of purchase, regardless of how many evenings the dining room's 14 chairs sat empty around the single-place setting at its head. Consider for a moment the ordinary texture of a single Tuesday in the middle of her 15th year in the house. She wakes at 7, as always, to the sound of the housemaid laying the fire in her bedroom grate before quietly withdrawing. Coffee arrives at past, along with the morning paper, folded precisely in thirds the way she prefers it. She reads the society pages first, out of habit rather than any particular interest, noting the names of families she once knew well, some of whom have drifted from her circle over the years, others who remain close. By 9, she has moved to her study to address correspondence, a letter to her sister in Philadelphia, a note to the hospital board confirming her attendance at Thursday's meeting, a brief and businesslike exchange with her attorney regarding a minor adjustment to the trust's investments. None of this correspondence mentions her husband, who has not written directly to her in nearly 4 months, though his own attorney has been in touch twice regarding an unrelated matter concerning a property he wishes to sell. Lunch is taken alone, a light meal in the small breakfast room rather than the formal dining room, which she reserves, by long habit now, for dinner and for the rare occasions guests are present. The afternoon brings a visit from the gardener, discussing the coming spring's plantings, and later, a call from a cousin passing through the city, who stays for tea and leaves by 4, in time for her to dress for a small dinner she's hosting that evening for members of the hospital auxiliary. The dinner itself is a modest affair, 6 guests rather than 14, but it fills the dining room with exactly the kind of warmth and conversation the room was originally built to hold. She is, by all accounts from those who attended such evenings, a genuinely gifted hostess, attentive to her guests, quick with conversation, skilled at the particular art of making a table of relative strangers feel, by the meal's end, like old friends. This skill, developed over years of exactly this kind of solitary hosting, had become one of the quiet accomplishments of her adult life. By 10, the guests have departed, the dining room has been cleared by the staff, and the house has returned to its more customary quiet. She retires to the sitting room for a final hour with a book before bed, the fire burning low, the particular silence of the house settling around her the way it does every evening, familiar now in a way that no longer registers as loneliness so much as simply the shape of her life. This was, in its essential rhythm, an entirely ordinary Tuesday, one of thousands that would accumulate indistinguishable from one another in their broad outline, across the decades she spent in this house. It is precisely this ordinariness that makes her story, and the stories of thousands of women like her, worth pausing over. There was no single dramatic event that defined her marriage's true shape. There was only this: Tuesday after Tuesday, dinner after dinner, a house maintained with love and precision for an occupancy that never quite matched its architecture, a life built carefully and deliberately around an absence that had, by this point in the story, become simply a fact of the landscape, no more remarkable to her than the weather outside her window. The other household. Across town, in a smaller but no less carefully appointed apartment on the west side of the park, a different household maintains its own quiet rhythms. This is not spoken of directly in the world the wife inhabits, not in letters, not in conversation, not even, for the most part, in the private thoughts she allows herself to linger on for very long. But it exists, as certainly as the townhouse she herself occupies, a second domestic life running in parallel to her own, funded by the same fortune, governed by none of the same paperwork. This second household was, in many cases of this kind, established gradually rather than all at once. A woman met through mutual acquaintances, perhaps at first entirely innocently, at a dinner party or a charity function. A friendship that deepened over months into something else. An arrangement eventually formalized in the sense that an apartment was let, expenses were quietly covered, and a life began to take shape that had no legal standing whatsoever, no deed, no settlement, no protection beyond the discretion of everyone involved. The woman at the centre of this second household understood her position, with a clarity that was, in its own way, no less complicated than the wife's own situation. She was not a wife. She would never be a wife, not while the marriage that preceded her remained legally intact, which, given the near impossibility of divorce for a man in his position, without triggering exactly the kind of scandal his family worked so hard to avoid, it very likely always would. She occupied a position with no formal name, no legal protection, no guaranteed allowance should the arrangement ever end. And yet, within the walls of that West Side apartment, something resembling ordinary domestic life did take place. Meals were shared. Evenings were spent together in a way that the marriage itself by this point almost never allowed. There were, in some of these arrangements, children, born outside the bounds of the legal marriage, given their father's attention, and often a portion of his time, though never, under the law of the period, his name or any guaranteed claim on his estate. It would be a mistake to render this second household purely as villainy, or the woman within it purely as a homewrecker in the melodramatic sense that phrase suggests. The realities were, almost always, considerably more complicated. Many of these women entered such arrangements with limited options of their own. Women of more modest means, sometimes actresses or performers whose professions already placed them outside the bounds of strict respectability, sometimes widows or women whose own prospects for a conventional marriage had narrowed for reasons of class, reputation, or simple economic necessity. For a man of considerable wealth navigating a marriage he had entered for reasons of family strategy rather than affection, this second household offered something the legal marriage could not, a relationship chosen freely, entered into without the mediation of lawyers and trustees, built around whatever genuine warmth or compatibility the two people involved actually shared. This did not make the arrangement fair. It simply explains why it was, for many men of this era and this class, so consistently chosen. The financial architecture of these second households varied considerably from case to case, but certain patterns recur throughout the records that survive. An apartment, typically leased under a name other than the husband's own, sometimes under the woman's name entirely, sometimes under a family retainer's. A monthly allowance paid in cash or through discreet transfers that left minimal paper trail. Household expenses covered directly, often through accounts established with local merchants who understood, without being told explicitly, the particular discretion the arrangement required. None of this was, strictly speaking, secret in the way the word usually implies. Household staff on both sides of the arrangement typically knew. Close friends often knew. In many cases the wife herself knew, or at minimum suspected strongly enough that the distinction between knowing and suspecting had become, for her, largely academic. What made these arrangements functional was not genuine secrecy, but a shared, unspoken agreement among everyone involved that certain facts, however widely known, would never be spoken aloud in any context that might force a public reckoning. This unspoken agreement extended even to correspondence. Letters between husband and mistress, where they survive in family archives, are often strikingly domestic in tone. Discussions of household matters, affectionate but restrained language, occasional mention of children's health or schooling. They read, in many respects, like the letters of any ordinary married couple discussing the ordinary business of a shared life. The absence of legal marriage did nothing to diminish the domestic reality both parties had built together. For the wife, awareness of this second household, however partial, however carefully she avoided confirming its precise details, shaped her own daily life in ways both subtle and profound. It explained the growing distance in her husband's letters home. It explained his diminishing presence at the townhouse, his increasingly perfunctory attendance at the handful of family occasions the separation agreement still required. It offered, in a strange way, a kind of clarity, an answer, even if never fully spoken, to questions she had once asked herself about what precisely had gone wrong. There is a particular grief specific to this kind of knowledge, not the grief of sudden loss, but a slower, more diffuse sorrow that settles gradually as suspicion hardens into near certainty. She did not confront her husband directly about the arrangement, not because she lacked the courage, but because confrontation offered nothing she actually wanted. It would not end the second household. It would not restore the marriage to some imagined earlier warmth. It would only force into the open a truth that, left unspoken, allowed both of them to continue functioning within the careful architecture the separation had already established. Some wives in her position developed over time an almost clinical detachment regarding their husbands' second households, a studied indifference that protected them from a pain they had no practical way to address. Others carried the knowledge more heavily, privately, in ways that surfaced only in rare, unguarded moments. A longer pause before answering a friend's innocent question about her husband's whereabouts, a particular quietness that settled over her on the anniversary of her wedding day each year. It is worth considering, too, what became of these second households when circumstances eventually shifted, when a husband died, when a fortune was depleted, when the careful financial architecture supporting a second life collapsed along with the first. Women in these positions had almost no legal recourse. They could not claim a widow's portion of an estate they had no legal standing within. They could not contest a will that made no provision for them, regardless of how many years or how many children the relationship had produced. Some second households ended with the woman receiving a final negotiated settlement, a lump sum, occasionally a modest trust, arranged quietly by the husband's attorneys in the same discreet manner that had governed the arrangement from its beginning. Others ended with nothing at all. The woman and any children left to navigate a world that offered them no legal claim on the fortune that had, for years, sustained their entire way of life. The precariousness of this position stood in sharp, permanent contrast to the wife's own carefully documented financial security. This asymmetry, a legal wife whose position, however emotionally hollow, was financially protected by 14 pages of careful legal language, set against a second household whose entire existence depended on the ongoing goodwill and continued life of one man, reveals something important about how wealth and law intersected during this era to protect certain relationships while leaving others entirely exposed. The marriage, whatever its emotional failures, remained the only relationship the law fully recognized. Everything else existed at the pleasure of those with the power to end it. The wife's own understanding of this asymmetry deepened over the years, and it complicated whatever anger she might otherwise have allowed herself toward the woman occupying that West Side apartment. She came, gradually, to view the situation less as a betrayal committed against her specifically, and more as a broader failure of an entire system, a marriage market that had never asked her opinion, a legal structure that offered her security precisely because it offered the other woman none, a set of social rules that had produced two women bound in entirely different ways to the same absent man. This was not forgiveness exactly. She never met the other woman, never corresponded with her, never acknowledged her existence in any document or conversation that survives in the family's papers. But something in her private reflections, recorded in a journal she kept intermittently across several decades, suggests an understanding that went beyond simple resentment, a recognition that both women had been shaped, in their different ways, by a system neither had fully chosen and neither could fully escape. The children born within these second households occupied a particularly difficult position, one that would shape the following chapter of this story in considerable detail. They grew up knowing their father, in many cases receiving his genuine affection and attention, and yet possessing none of the legal standing that would have secured their future in the way legitimate children's futures were secured. They existed, much like their mothers, in a space the law simply declined to formally recognize. As this chapter closes, it is worth sitting with the strange symmetry between these two households, one legally sanctioned and emotionally hollow, the other emotionally full and legally unprotected, both funded by the same fortune, both organized around the same absent man, both, in their different ways, monuments to a system that asked women to build entire lives around a single central uncertainty, whether the man whose name and money sustained their household would continue, indefinitely, to do so. There is no tidy resolution to offer here, No single verdict that fairly weighs the wife's quiet, documented security against the mistress's warmer but entirely unprotected domestic life. Both women, in their own ways, spent decades constructing meaning and stability within circumstances shaped almost entirely by decisions made by men. A father who arranged a marriage, a husband who chose a second household, a legal system that recognized one relationship and simply looked away from the other. Let the story rest here for now in this uneasy symmetry, before moving forward into what these arrangements meant for the children caught, quite literally between two homes. It is worth adding some further texture to how these second households actually functioned on an ordinary day, because the popular imagination of a Gilded Age mistress, glamorous, scandalous, living a life of constant intrigue, rarely matches the quieter reality that emerges from surviving letters and household accounts. The West Side apartment in this story ran on much the same rhythms as any respectable household of its era. A cook prepared meals. A single maid managed the modest domestic work the apartment required. Mornings brought coffee and correspondence, afternoons brought errands, visits from a small circle of trusted friends, the ordinary business of managing a home. The woman who kept this household understood, with a clarity that grew sharper each year, that her security depended entirely on the continued affection and continued life of one man. She kept her own careful records, not of legal entitlements since she possessed almost none, but of promises made, of assurances given, of the small verbal commitments a man in her position might offer in place of the legal protections he could not or would not provide. These records would matter enormously in the way that unenforceable promises sometimes do in the years that followed. Her days, much like the wife's own days across town, followed a pattern shaped around waiting for visits that came on no fixed schedule, waiting for word of when he might next appear, structuring an entire domestic life around a presence that arrived only intermittently and departed, always, back toward the other household, the legitimate one, the one with its name on deeds and its status recorded in the social register. In this respect, her position mirrored the wife's own more closely than either woman likely recognized. Both were, in their different ways, waiting for a man whose primary obligations lay elsewhere. The apartment itself, modest by comparison to the townhouse across the park but comfortable and well appointed by any ordinary standard, contained small evidences of the domestic warmth this arrangement genuinely provided. A child's toys in a corner of the sitting room, a stack of correspondence tied with ribbon and kept in a desk drawer, photographs displayed on the mantel that would never have been welcome in the townhouse's more formal, more carefully curated rooms. This was, whatever its lack of legal standing, a home in every meaningful sense the word usually carries. When word of such arrangements did occasionally surface publicly, through a scandal, a lawsuit, a particularly indiscreet gossip column, the social consequences fell almost entirely on the women involved rather than the men. A husband's infidelity, however widely suspected or even confirmed, rarely diminished his own standing in society to any significant degree. The mistress, by contrast, risked complete social exile should her situation become public knowledge in a way that could no longer be quietly managed. This asymmetry extended the same fundamental unfairness that shaped the wife's own position into an entirely different register. It is this shared vulnerability, more than any direct contact between them, that ultimately connects these two women's stories most deeply. Neither controlled the terms of her own life to the degree a modern reader might wish for either of them. Both depended in different ways on the same man's continued willingness to honour obligations that only one of them held any legal power to enforce. Both built homes, raised expectations, structured entire lives around a presence that came and went according to a calendar neither woman had any real power to set. Evening falls the same way over both households, the same autumn light softening across the park that separates them, the same particular hour when lamps are lit and staff withdraw, and each woman settles into whatever version of solitude or companionship her particular circumstances have provided that day. Neither house is silent in the way a truly empty house is silent. Both are full of ordinary domestic sound, a clock ticking, a fire settling, the distant murmur of a household still, in its own quiet way, functioning exactly as a household should. There exists in the surviving correspondence between the husband and the woman in the West Side apartment a particular letter written during a stretch of several weeks when illness kept him largely confined to the legal household, unable to make his usual visits. The letter, warm and worried in equal measure, inquires after her health and the children's well-being, describes his own recovery in some detail, and closes with an expression of longing that reads, on the page, as entirely genuine, the words of a man missing a home he considers, in every sense but the legal one, fully his own. It is tempting, reading such a letter, to cast the wife across town as the wronged party, and the woman receiving this letter as the beneficiary of a warmth the wife herself never received. But this framing, however emotionally satisfying, oversimplifies a situation that resists easy division into wronged and fortunate parties. The woman receiving that tender letter would, within a decade, face her own reckoning with the fundamental precariousness of her position, a reckoning the wife, whatever her own losses, would never need to face given the careful legal protections her own settlement provided. That reckoning arrived when the husband's health, already fragile in the letter just described, began its final decline some years later. As his condition worsened, questions of estate and inheritance grew urgent in a way they had never needed to be during the years of his good health. His attorneys, representing the interests of his legitimate estate, made clear to the woman in the West Side apartment that she possessed no enforceable claim on his fortune, regardless of the decades and the children the relationship had produced. The final arrangement, negotiated in the last months of his life, provided her a modest settlement, considerably less than what continued to flow to the wife across town under the original deed of separation, negotiated decades earlier by attorneys thinking carefully about exactly this eventual outcome. The disparity between these two settlements, one protected by careful legal architecture and one dependent entirely on a dying man's final wishes, offers perhaps the starkest illustration available of how differently the law treated these two women, despite the genuine warmth and duration of both relationships. There are 7 dates marked in red ink in the small leather diary she keeps on her writing desk, and each one represents an occasion the separation agreement requires her to attend as his wife. The Easter service at the family's church, the anniversary dinner held each June regardless of what the marriage itself has or has not accomplished in the preceding year, the Christmas portrait commissioned annually by his mother and printed onto cards that will travel to relatives across the country, a handful of funerals and weddings within the extended family, whenever they happen to fall. Preparing for these occasions has become over the years a discipline of its own, one she approaches with the same careful attention she once brought to planning her own wedding. A dress chosen weeks in advance, appropriate to the occasion, but never so striking as to suggest she's trying too hard or too little to perform the role required of her. Hair arranged by her lady's maid in a style neither too fashionable nor too plain. Every detail calibrated toward a single goal, appearing for a handful of hours entirely and convincingly like a woman in a functioning marriage. The anniversary dinner is, in some ways, the most demanding of these occasions, precisely because it requires the most sustained performance. 12 or 14 guests seated around the dining table that otherwise serves a household of 1, watching a husband and wife who see each other perhaps 6 times a year, navigate an evening of toasts and conversation and the small, practiced intimacies, a hand briefly on a shoulder, a shared glance across the table, that a genuinely happy couple might offer without a second thought, and that she and her husband have learned to produce on cue. He arrives, for these occasions, punctually and appropriately dressed, greeting her at the door with a kiss on the cheek that guests interpret as affection, and both of them understand, privately, as choreography. They have never discussed, in any explicit terms, how to perform these evenings successfully. It simply developed, over the years, into a kind of practiced fluency. The right questions to ask each other in front of guests, the right stories to tell about a shared life that exists in reality almost entirely on paper. The guests at these dinners are, for the most part, entirely convinced by the performance. This is not because they are naive, but because the performance is, in its way, genuinely skilled, refined over years of exactly this kind of practice. A marriage does not need to be warm in private to appear warm in public, provided both parties understand precisely what is required of them and are motivated, for reasons of their own, to deliver it convincingly. Occasionally, a guest with sharper instincts than most will notice something slightly off. A pause that lasts a beat too long, a question that goes unanswered in the natural flow of conversation, a moment where husband and wife seem to be reading from a script rather than speaking spontaneously. These observations, when they occur, are almost never voiced aloud. They register instead as a vague impression, filed away, perhaps mentioned years later in a private conversation between old friends who have by then pieced together enough fragments to understand roughly what they witnessed. The Christmas portrait requires its own particular preparation. A photographer arrives at the family's main estate each December, setting up equipment in the drawing room while 3 generations of the family assemble in their finest clothing. She and her husband are positioned by long-standing convention beside each other, his hand resting lightly at her waist, both of them arranging their faces into the same warm, composed expression the family has presented in this same photograph for decades. The resulting image, printed onto heavy cardstock and mailed to several hundred relatives and acquaintances each year, becomes the primary evidence most people outside the immediate family ever see of the marriage's condition. A distant cousin in Ohio, receiving this card each December, has no reason to imagine anything other than a happy, conventional marriage. A husband and wife standing close together, smiling, surrounded by children and grandchildren, exactly as a family portrait is supposed to look. This is, in its way, the central function of the entire calendar of required appearances, the production of evidence. Not evidence in a legal sense, though the appearances do serve that purpose too, satisfying the terms of the separation agreement and protecting both parties from any accusation that the marriage has been effectively abandoned. But evidence in a broader social sense, proof circulated regularly enough to remain convincing that the marriage continues to function according to its original terms, whatever the daily reality behind that evidence might actually be. The funerals, when they occur, bring their own particular difficulty. Grief is harder to perform than warmth, and easier to observe as insincere when it is. She has learned, over the years, to manage these occasions by focusing genuinely on whatever loss the family is actually mourning, an uncle, a cousin, eventually her own mother-in-law, allowing real grief for the person being buried to substitute for whatever performance the marriage itself might otherwise require. Genuine sorrow, it turns out, is easier to sustain convincingly than manufactured affection. Weddings present the opposite challenge. A family wedding requires visible joy, celebration, the appearance of a couple happily anticipating decades more of marriage themselves. She has attended perhaps a dozen such weddings over the years, nieces, cousins, the children of old family friends, each one requiring her to dance briefly, with a husband she's not embraced privately and longer than she cares to calculate, to raise a glass in a toast to a young couple's future, while carefully not thinking too closely about what her own marital future actually looks like. There is a particular skill, developed only through years of practice, in maintaining this performance without visible strain. She has watched other women in similar positions fail at it, a stiffness in the shoulders that reads, to a practiced observer, as discomfort rather than simple reserve, a smile that arrives a half-second late, betraying the effort required to produce it. She has worked, deliberately, to avoid these tells, understanding that a convincing performance protects not only her own standing but her husband's, and by extension both of their families. It would be easy to view this calendar of appearances as pure hardship, a series of small humiliations she is contractually obligated to endure. And there is truth in that view, but there is also, within the performance itself, something closer to craft, a skill she has developed and refined, taken a certain private pride in executing well, much as she takes pride in running her household or planning a successful dinner party. The performance costs her something each time. It also increasingly demonstrates a competence she has come to value in herself. Between these 7 marked dates, the calendar of her actual life proceeds according to an entirely different rhythm. The committees, the correspondence, the quiet, ordinary days at the townhouse that make up the overwhelming majority of her year. The 7 red ink dates stand out precisely because they are exceptions, brief and demanding intrusions of a fiction into a life otherwise organised around considerably more honest terms. As she has grown older, the preparation required for these occasions has changed in character, if not in scope. The dresses have grown more restrained, matching an age where restraint reads as elegance rather than caution. The choreography with her husband has grown, if anything, more practiced. Two people who have spent decades perfecting a performance neither particularly enjoys, but both have long since accepted as one of the ongoing costs of the arrangement they signed years earlier in that fourth-floor law office. What she has never quite grown accustomed to, even after so many years, is the particular disorientation of the drive home from these occasions. Stepping out of a carriage, later an automobile at her own front door, removing a performance the way one might remove a costume, and stepping back into the considerably quieter, considerably more honest reality of her actual daily life. The transition happens every time, predictable and familiar, and every time it carries a small, private strangeness that never quite fully dissolves. The calendar itself, marked in red ink each January for the year ahead, has become, over the decades, less a source of dread and more simply one more administrative fact of her life, scheduled and prepared for with the same practical efficiency she brings to every other aspect of running her household. 7 dates, a handful of hours each. A performance she has learned, through long practice, to deliver convincingly before returning, each time, to the considerably more honest architecture of the life she's built for herself in the 11 rooms across town. There is a particular evening worth describing in more detail, because it captures, more precisely than any general description could, the exact texture of what these performances actually required. It is the anniversary dinner in her 20th year of marriage, and she has spent the better part of the afternoon overseeing preparations. Flowers arranged by a florist who has served the family for a decade, a menu selected weeks earlier in consultation with the cook, place cards written in her own careful hand, each one positioning guests according to a social calculus she has grown expert in over the years. Her husband arrives at 7, exactly as expected, dressed in evening clothes that fit him considerably better than the ones he wore on their wedding day 2 decades earlier. He has aged, as she has, into a more settled version of the young man she barely knew when they married. There is, in this aging, something almost companionable. Not intimacy exactly, but a shared recognition of time past, of two people who have navigated the same strange arrangement for 2 full decades, and arrived, each in their own way, at a kind of practiced equilibrium. They greet arriving guests together at the door, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back, a gesture so long practiced it no longer requires conscious thought from either of them. Conversation flows easily through the early part of the evening, guests inquiring after mutual acquaintances, discussing the political news of the day, admiring the flowers and the meal with the genuine warmth of people enjoying themselves at a well-run dinner party. By any external measure, the evening is an unqualified success. At the appropriate moment, her husband rises to offer the anniversary toast, a brief speech he has clearly prepared in advance, touching on the usual themes such toasts require: gratitude for the guest's presence, a light-hearted joke about the passage of time, a final line directed at her specifically, thanking her for 20 years of partnership. The guests raise their glasses. She smiles, meets his eyes across the table, and offers the small, practiced nod that has become her own contribution to this particular ritual. What none of the guests can see, in this moment, is the private calculation happening behind both of their carefully composed expressions. 2 people executing a performance they have rehearsed, in effect, for 20 years, each fully aware of what the other is doing, each grateful, in their own private way, for the other's continued willingness to do it well. This is not cynicism exactly. It is something closer to a strange, unspoken partnership, built not on love, but on mutual competence, mutual discretion, and a shared understanding of what the evening requires of them both. After the guests depart, sometime past 11, the 2 of them stand for a moment in the entrance hall, the performance officially concluded, the house beginning its return to its accustomed quiet. These moments, brief as they are, carry their own particular strangeness. Husband and wife, alone together for perhaps the only unobserved minutes of the entire visit, uncertain, even after 20 years, exactly how to occupy the space between performance and genuine interaction. On this particular evening he asks after their son's progress at school, and she answers honestly, at some length, grateful for a question that requires no performance at all, simply an ordinary exchange between 2 parents who, whatever else has failed between them, remain genuinely invested in their children's well-being. This conversation, brief and unremarkable as it is, represents one of the more honest moments the marriage still regularly produces. Proof that beneath the elaborate architecture of required appearance, something resembling ordinary human connection occasionally still surfaces. He departs the following morning, as scheduled, back toward whatever obligations and whatever household await him elsewhere. She watches from the window as his carriage pulls away, then turns back to the considerable work of restoring the house to its ordinary rhythms. Flowers cleared, place settings returned to storage, the dining room reset for its customary table of one. The performance concluded successfully for another year. 6 more required appearances remain on the calendar before January brings the cycle around again. Not every required appearance proceeded with such practiced smoothness. There is a family wedding, recorded in some detail in her private correspondence, where the performance nearly failed entirely. A moment, brief but unmistakable, when a cousin's pointed question about their travel plans for the following spring caught both husband and wife visibly unprepared, neither having discussed or coordinated an answer in advance, their mismatched replies overlapping awkwardly before the conversation moved mercifully to other subjects. She wrote to her sister afterward describing the moment with a kind of rueful humour that had, by this point in her life, become her characteristic way of processing such difficulties. They had, she noted, spent 20 years perfecting nearly every aspect of their public performance, and had somehow still overlooked something as basic as coordinating a shared answer to an entirely predictable question. The lapse embarrassed her privately, though she suspected correctly as it turned out that most of the guests present had noticed nothing amiss at all. These small failures in the performance, rare as they were across so many decades of practice, served as useful reminders of the effort the whole arrangement actually required, effort so thoroughly internalized by this point that its absence, however brief, felt more startling than its presence ever did. The performance had become, in every meaningful sense, a genuine skill, one that occasionally slipped precisely because it had grown so automatic that neither party gave it the conscious attention such automaticity can sometimes require. As the years advanced further, the calendar itself began gradually to contract. Aging relatives who had once required attendance at their own anniversary celebrations passed on, one by one, each departure quietly removing an obligation from the list without ever being discussed in those terms. By her 50th year, only 4 of the original 7 required appearances remained current. The Christmas portrait now including grandchildren, 2 remaining family weddings among younger cousins, and funerals, which arrived, as they do at that stage of life, with increasing and unwelcome regularity. This contraction brought its own complicated feelings. Fewer required appearances meant fewer performances to prepare for and sustain, a genuine relief after so many decades of careful management. But it also meant fewer occasions, however artificial their underlying premise, on which she and her husband appeared together as a unit, however constructed that unit had always been. There was, she admitted to herself in her private journal, an unexpected loneliness in the calendar's thinning, a reminder of just how much of her connection to a shared family narrative had depended on precisely these carefully staged occasions. There were, in this particular marriage, 2 children, a son born in the 2nd year, before the distance between husband and wife had fully settled into its permanent shape, and a daughter born some years later, after the deed of separation had already been signed, conceived during one of the required visits the agreement still permitted. Both children grew up understanding, in the particular unspoken way children absorb the true architecture of their households, long before anyone explains it to them directly, that their family did not resemble the families of most of their friends. Their father's visits followed the same calendar that governed the required appearances described in the previous chapter. A portion of the summer, a stretch around Christmas, occasional weekends scattered through the year when business or obligation brought him back to the city. The children learned to treat these visits as events, distinct from ordinary life, requiring their best behaviour, their finest clothes, a kind of heightened attentiveness that even very young children can sense is expected of them without being told explicitly why. The son, older and therefore more aware of the gap between his own household and his friends' households, asked questions his mother answered as honestly as the era's conventions allowed. His father travelled for business. His father's work required him to be away often. These explanations satisfied him for a time, the way children accept explanations from parents they trust. before the natural curiosity of adolescence began to probe more insistently at the edges of a story that no longer quite held together under closer examination. By the time he was 12, the son had pieced together largely on his own a reasonably accurate understanding of his parents' actual arrangement, not through any single revelation, but through the accumulation of small observations any perceptive child eventually gathers. The way his mother's shoulders tightened slightly whenever his father's name came up in casual conversation. The particular silence that fell over adult conversations when he entered a room unexpectedly. The photographs on the mantel that showed a family posed together and somehow, despite the careful composition, never quite looked like a family that actually lived together. He never confronted his mother directly with this understanding, and she, for her part, never volunteered more than the careful, age-appropriate explanations she had offered since he was small. This was, in its way, its own kind of unspoken agreement between them, mother and son each aware that the other understood more than either was saying, both content to let the fuller truth remain unspoken, rather than force a conversation that could serve no obviously useful purpose. The daughter, born after her parents' separation, had already been formalized, grew up with an even more attenuated relationship to her father than her older brother had. She knew him primarily through his scheduled visits, through the careful stories her mother told about family history and lineage, through the framed photographs that populated the townhouse's more formal rooms. Her father was, for much of her early childhood, less a daily presence than a recurring, somewhat ceremonial figure who appeared at predictable intervals and then departed again. This distance shaped her in ways that would become more apparent in her adult life. She grew into a young woman notably careful about emotional commitment, watchful in relationships in a way her friends sometimes found puzzling, having learned early and thoroughly that presence could not always be relied upon, that even the people whose love was genuine might nonetheless be, for reasons entirely outside a child's control or understanding, largely absent from the actual texture of daily life. Both children, in their different ways, grew up acutely aware of their family's particular arrangement without ever discussing it explicitly among themselves, a silence that mirrored, in miniature, the larger silence that governed their mother's entire adult life. This was perhaps the arrangement's most significant cost, not simply the absence itself, but the culture of careful non-disclosure that absence required, a household organised as much around what could not be said as around what actually was. Their father, for his part, appears in surviving letters to have genuinely loved both children, in whatever limited capacity his divided life allowed. His correspondence with his son, preserved among the family's papers, is warm and attentive, full of advice about schooling and genuine interest in the boy's developing interests and ambitions. He remembered birthdays. He arranged, on several occasions, for tutors and opportunities that reflected real investment in his children's futures. The love, in other words, was not absent. Its consistency was. This inconsistency is, in many ways, harder for children to process than a more straightforward absence would have been. A father entirely uninvolved can be understood, eventually, as simply gone. A father who appears periodically with genuine warmth and attention, only to disappear again for months at a time, creates a more complicated emotional landscape, one where love and abandonment coexist, where a child learns to treasure a parent's presence precisely because its scarcity has taught them never to take it for granted. The mother navigated this complicated landscape with considerable skill, working to ensure her children understood their father's love as genuine, even while their circumstances remained, in practical terms, unconventional. She rarely spoke ill of him in front of the children, understanding that whatever her own private feelings about the marriage, her son and daughter deserved a relationship with their father, unburdened by her own disappointment. This restraint cost her something. There were undoubtedly evenings when the effort of maintaining this careful neutrality felt considerably heavier than she allowed herself to show. As the children grew into adulthood, both eventually married, the son into a family not unlike his mother's own, the daughter into a marriage that, by the accounts that survive, proved considerably warmer and more conventional than the one she'd grown up observing. Whether this reflected a deliberate choice, shaped by watching her parents' arrangement so closely, or simply the ordinary unfolding of circumstance, the surviving letters do not definitively say. But it is tempting, reading her correspondence from this period, to sense in her a particular determination to build something different than what she had known as a child. the son's relationship with his own eventual children would carry forward, in subtle ways, the patterns established in his own childhood. He was, by most accounts, a present and attentive father, perhaps deliberately so, having learned early the particular cost of a father's absence and determined, consciously or not to replicate it. This is perhaps one of the more hopeful threads running through this larger story, the way even difficult family patterns can, in the following generation, be recognized, examined, and deliberately set aside. It would be inaccurate to suggest either child emerged from this childhood entirely unmarked. Both carried, into their own adult lives, a particular wariness around questions of presence and permanence that trace directly back to a childhood spent watching their mother maintain a marriage that existed primarily on paper, and their father divide his attention and affection between two households neither child fully understood until they were old enough to piece the truth together themselves. And yet both children also carried forward something considerably more positive, a genuine admiration for their mother's quiet resilience, the particular dignity with which she had built and maintained a full life, despite circumstances that offered her very little control. In letters written decades later, both son and daughter would describe their mother, independently and in strikingly similar language, as the single most capable person either of them had ever known, a description that says as much about what they witnessed growing up as it does about her. As this chapter closes, it is worth sitting for a moment with the particular image of two children, growing up in a house built for a much larger family, learning gradually and largely without direct explanation the true shape of their parents' arrangement, and finding, within that difficult inheritance, both real love and real loss in roughly equal measure, a childhood that was neither the simple tragedy nor the simple happiness that any single word could adequately capture. Consider one particular Christmas, the son's 14th, which survives in unusual detail through a letter the mother wrote to her sister shortly afterward. The father had arrived 2 days before the holiday, as the calendar required, and the household had settled into the particular rhythm his presence always produced. Heightened attentiveness from the children, a formality in the household's daily operation that the staff too seemed to absorb, as though the entire house held itself slightly straighter during these visits. On Christmas morning itself, gifts were exchanged in the drawing room with a warmth that, on the surface, resembled any ordinary family celebration. The father had chosen his children's presents with evident care. A telescope for the son, who had developed a passing interest in astronomy that year, and a set of watercolours for the daughter, who had shown an early talent for drawing that her mother had been quietly encouraging. These were not the gifts of a disengaged father performing minimal obligation. They were the gifts of a man who had, in his limited way, been paying genuine attention. The son, unwrapping the telescope, looked up at his father with an expression his mother would later describe in her letter as almost painfully hopeful. The look of a boy who wanted quite badly for this moment of connection to mean something lasting, to signal a father who might now, having demonstrated such careful attention, begin showing up more consistently in the months ahead. The mother watched this expression with her own complicated mixture of feelings, glad for her son's evident happiness and privately certain, from 12 years of accumulated experience, that the hopeful expectation would not be fulfilled. It was not fulfilled. The father departed on the 3rd of January as scheduled and did not return until the following summer, a gap of nearly 6 months during which his correspondence with his son, while affectionate, remained sparse. 3 letters, by the mother's count, each of them brief, each of them warm in tone but limited in the kind of sustained daily attention a 14-year-old boy might reasonably have hoped for from a father who had, just weeks earlier, seemed so genuinely present. This pattern, genuine warmth during scheduled visits, followed by extended absence that the warmth itself made somehow harder to bear, repeated itself across both children's entire childhoods, a rhythm they eventually learned to anticipate and, to whatever degree possible, protect themselves against. The son, in particular, developed a habit of moderating his own enthusiasm during his father's visits, a kind of protective reserve that his mother noticed with some sadness, understanding it as the natural response of a child who had learned, through repeated experience, that hope invested too fully in his father's presence would inevitably be disappointed. The daughter's experience, coming as it did after the separation had already been fully formalized, carried a somewhat different character. She never knew a version of her family that included daily paternal presence. and so experienced her father's periodic visits less as a painful contrast to some earlier, warmer arrangement, and more simply as the established pattern of her life, unusual by comparison to her friends' families certainly, but not accompanied by the particular grief of loss her older brother sometimes carried, since she had never possessed what he remembered losing. This distinction mattered considerably to how each child ultimately processed their unusual upbringing. The son carried, into his own adulthood, a lingering wariness around emotional investment that his mother traced directly back to those repeated cycles of hope and disappointment. The daughter, by contrast, developed what her mother described, admiringly, as a kind of clear-eyed practicality about family relationships generally, an ability to value what presence and affection were actually offered, without measuring them constantly against some imagined, more complete alternative. Both children, as adults, would eventually discuss these dynamics with their own mother in conversations considerably more direct than anything that had been possible during their childhood years. The son, in one such conversation preserved in a later letter, thanked his mother explicitly for never having spoken ill of their father during his visits, acknowledging that this restraint, difficult as it must have been for her, had allowed him to form his own genuine relationship with his father rather than one coloured by his mother's own complicated feelings. This acknowledgement meant a great deal to her, she wrote in a subsequent letter to her sister, precisely because the restraint had indeed been difficult, perhaps one of the more consistently demanding aspects of her entire arrangement, requiring her to set aside her own considerable disappointment in service of her children's uncomplicated access to whatever affection their father genuinely offered them. It was, she reflected, one of the clearer examples of a broader pattern that had defined so much of her adult life, absorbing difficulty privately so that those around her could experience something closer to ease. The daughter's own eventual conversation with her mother about these matters took a somewhat different shape than her brother's had, arriving later in life and prompted in part by the daughter's own experience of motherhood. Watching her own children navigate the ordinary disappointments of childhood, she found herself returning, with new understanding, to questions about how her mother had managed to shield both children so consistently from the fuller weight of her own private disappointment during all those years of scheduled visits and extended absences. Her mother's answer, recorded in the daughter's own later memoir, was characteristically practical rather than sentimental. She had simply decided early on that her children deserved a childhood unburdened by adult grievances they had no power to resolve. This decision required constant active maintenance rather than a single act of will, countless small moments where she set aside a sharp reply, softened an honest answer, redirected a conversation that risked drifting toward territory better left for her own private reflection, rather than her children's developing understanding of their family. This deliberate protection came, inevitably, at some cost to her own emotional processing. Where a more openly expressive parent might have found some relief in occasionally voicing frustration or grief in front of her children, she chose instead to carry these feelings largely alone, reserving their fuller expression for her private journal, for her closest friends within the network of women described in the following chapter, or simply for no one at all. This was, she acknowledged late in life, both her chosen gift to her children and one of the more genuinely lonely aspects of her particular circumstances. There is a final detail from this period worth including, drawn from a letter the son wrote his mother during his own first year away at university. Reflecting, with the particular clarity distance sometimes provides, on the household he had grown up in, he wrote that he had come to understand his childhood not as deprived exactly, but as unusually attentive in ways he had failed to fully appreciate at the time. A mother who had, he now realized, built an entire structure of stability and warmth specifically to compensate for what circumstances beyond her control had made impossible to provide in full. This letter, preserved among her most treasured papers according to her daughter's later account, offered her a particular form of validation that no amount of external social approval could have matched. Her son had seen, eventually, the considerable effort behind what had so often felt, during the years she was actually performing it, like simple necessity rather than achievement. This recognition, arriving as it did from the person for whose sake she had exercised such careful and constant restraint, mattered to her more than almost any other acknowledgement she received across her entire adult life. She was not, of course, alone in her particular circumstance. though for many years she believed herself to be more alone in it than she actually was. It took a chance conversation at a hospital board meeting some 6 years into the separation for her to discover that a woman she had known socially for over a decade lived under an almost identical arrangement. A husband who appeared for scheduled occasions and otherwise maintained a separate life. A townhouse run for an occupancy of 1. A deed of separation drafted by lawyers in an office not unlike the one where her own had been signed. The conversation that revealed this shared circumstance happened almost by accident, the way such conversations often did among women of this era, conducted through careful indirection rather than direct statement. A comment about how quiet the house had been since the children left for school. A knowing pause where an unhappier woman might have filled the silence with false enthusiasm about her husband's whereabouts. A shared glance that communicated, without a single word spoken plainly, that both women understood exactly what the other was navigating. From this single conversation grew, gradually over the following years, a small and entirely informal network of women in similar circumstances, perhaps 6 or 7 at its widest extent, connected through overlapping social circles, hospital boards, garden clubs, the countless small institutions that structured the social lives of women in their position. They did not organise formally. They did not, for the most part, discuss their situations with the directness a modern reader might expect. But they found each other, gradually, and in finding each other, discovered something considerably more valuable than mere company. The particular value of this network lay less in any explicit discussion of their shared circumstances, and more in the simple, sustaining fact of mutual recognition. A woman who has spent years performing contentment for an outside world that has no reason to question the performance experiences something close to relief in the presence of others who require no performance at all, who understand, without needing to be told, precisely what a particular silence means, precisely what effort underlies a particular practiced smile at a family gathering. They met ostensibly for entirely ordinary reasons: a monthly luncheon organised around hospital board business, an annual garden tour that rotated among their various properties, correspondence exchanged in the guise of ordinary social letters. Beneath these ordinary occasions ran a current of genuine support that none of them would have named directly, but all of them relied upon. A letter arriving at exactly the right moment, offering no direct commentary on a difficult anniversary, but somehow, in its warmth and timing, acknowledging it anyway. One member of this small circle, a woman some 8 years older than our central figure, became something close to a mentor in the particular art of building a full life within these circumstances. She had lived under her own separation arrangement for nearly 2 decades by the time the friendship formed, and she offered, through example rather than direct instruction, a kind of quiet demonstration that the years ahead need not simply be endured, but could, with sufficient deliberate effort, actually be built into something worth living. This older woman had developed, over her own 2 decades of practice, an entire philosophy of sorts regarding what she called, in one surviving letter, the art of sufficient occupation, the deliberate cultivation of interests, responsibilities, and relationships substantial enough to fill a life that circumstance had otherwise left with considerable empty space. Her own version of this philosophy centred on an ambitious programme of horticultural research, cultivating rare varieties of orchid in a specially built conservatory that had, by the time of her death, become genuinely significant within botanical circles. The lesson she offered, both through direct conversation and through the example of her own carefully constructed life, was not that the pain of these circumstances should be denied or minimised, but that pain and a full life were not in fact mutually exclusive. A woman could grieve, privately and periodically, the marriage she had once hoped for, while simultaneously building something genuinely substantial and satisfying within the actual shape her life had taken. The two things could coexist. Neither needed to cancel out the other. This philosophy proved genuinely useful to the woman at the centre of this story, offering her a framework for understanding her own increasingly elaborate garden, her deepening involvement with the hospital board, her careful cultivation of the household that had become, over the years, considerably more than mere shelter. She began to understand these pursuits not as consolation prizes for a marriage that had failed to deliver what she once hoped, but as genuine achievements in their own right, worthy of the same pride any accomplishment deserves. The network of women sustained itself through decades, its membership shifting gradually as some moved away or eventually passed on, and new women joined as their own circumstances brought them into the same overlapping social world. Letters from this period, preserved across several family archives, reveal a correspondence remarkable for its warmth, its wit, and its careful, sustained refusal to dwell excessively on the shared circumstance that had originally brought its members together. There were, of course, limits to what this support could actually provide. No amount of mutual understanding among women in similar circumstances could restore what none of them had ever fully possessed: a marriage built on genuine partnership rather than family strategy, a husband whose presence could be relied upon rather than scheduled. The network offered companionship, understanding, and practical wisdom about how to build a life within difficult constraints. It could not and did not pretend to remove the constraints themselves. What it offered instead was something perhaps more valuable given the actual circumstances these women faced: proof, sustained across decades of friendship, that they were not uniquely unfortunate, not somehow failing at a task other women managed successfully. Their circumstances were common enough, among women of their particular class and era, to have produced an entire quiet subculture of shared understanding, developed strategies, and genuine mutual support that operated almost entirely beneath the surface of the more visible social world both groups of women continued to navigate. As she grew older, she would come to view this network of friendship as one of the genuine, unexpected gifts her circumstances had produced. Relationships built on a foundation of complete honesty that her more conventional friendships, constrained as they were by the general social requirement to present a happy face regardless of private reality, could never quite match. There was, she wrote in one letter to a cousin, a particular freedom in friendships where nothing needed to be performed, where the usual careful management of appearances could, for a few precious hours, simply be set down. This chapter closes with an image worth holding on to. A small group of women gathered on a summer afternoon in someone's garden, drinking tea, discussing books and children and the ordinary business of their considerable social obligations, each one carrying, beneath the pleasant surface of the conversation, an understanding of the other's true circumstances that required no explanation, no confession, no performance of a happiness none of them entirely felt. In this understanding, quietly and without ceremony, something genuinely valuable had been built. One particular member of this network deserves further mention, if only because her situation illustrates just how varied these arrangements could be, even among women who, on the surface, appeared to share nearly identical circumstances. This woman, whom our central figure had known since childhood, occupied a separation agreement considerably less generous than her own. A husband whose family fortune had diminished significantly by the time of their marriage, leaving her with an allowance that required careful, constant management rather than the more comfortable margin the central figure herself enjoyed. This friend's household operated on a noticeably smaller scale. 3 rooms in regular use rather than 11, a staff of 2 rather than 6, a garden tended by her own hands rather than a hired professional. And yet, by every account that survives, her days carried much the same essential rhythm as everyone else's in their small circle. Mornings organised around correspondence and household management, afternoons filled with committee work and visiting, evenings spent largely alone, punctuated by the same calendar of required appearances that governed all their lives in roughly similar measure. The friendship between these 2 women, sustained across more than 3 decades, offers a particularly clear window into what this network actually provided its members. They exchanged letters weekly for most of their adult lives, letters that survive today in remarkable volume, chronicling not only the broad outlines of their respective circumstances, but the countless small details of daily life that make any sustained friendship genuinely rich. Recipes exchanged, books recommended, minor domestic crises resolved through shared advice, children's progress reported and celebrated. What strikes a modern reader examining this correspondence is how rarely the actual subject of their marriages appears directly, and how completely its presence nonetheless permeates nearly every letter. A comment about how peaceful the house has been this month. A brief, almost throwaway mention of preparing for an upcoming family obligation. A slightly longer pause, in the rhythm of the prose itself, around the anniversary of a wedding day. The marriages are never discussed at length, and yet they shape, invisibly, nearly everything else the letters actually contain. This indirect mode of communication, developed over years of practice, allowed both women to offer each other genuine support without ever requiring the more painful directness that naming their circumstances explicitly might have demanded. There is a particular wisdom in this approach, one that a more modern sensibility, accustomed to valuing direct emotional expression, might initially undervalue. Sometimes these letters suggest the kindest form of support is precisely the kind that allows a difficult truth to remain comfortably unspoken while still, somehow, being fully understood. The network's influence extended, too, into practical matters beyond emotional support. Members shared attorneys, recommended reliable household staff to one another, exchanged advice about managing trust investments during periods of market uncertainty. In this sense, the network functioned as something closer to an informal professional association than a purely social circle, a group of women pooling accumulated expertise about how to navigate circumstances that the broader society around them offered almost no formal guidance for managing. By the time the central figure in this story reached her own later years, she had become in turn something of a mentor herself to younger women entering similar arrangements, a role she approached with the same careful, indirect warmth the older friend had once offered her. She never sought out this role deliberately. It simply accumulated, the natural consequence of having lived successfully, by most measures, within circumstances that younger women, newly navigating their own separation agreements, found genuinely daunting to face without any established guide. One such younger woman, a niece by marriage entering her own separation arrangement some 25 years after the central figure had signed her own, later described their relationship in terms that illuminate precisely what this informal mentorship provided. She recalled, in particular, a single conversation conducted over tea in the same second-floor sitting room that had witnessed so much of the central figure's own adult life, in which her aunt offered not sympathy exactly, but something closer to practical reassurance, a clear-eyed accounting of what the years ahead would likely require, delivered with enough warmth that the accounting itself felt bearable, rather than simply grim. "You will build a life," her aunt told her. "According to this later account, it will not be the life you imagined. It will, if you let it, still be genuinely yours." This particular phrase, brief as it was, stayed with the younger woman across the following decades of her own marriage, offered as a kind of touchstone during the inevitable difficult periods that her own arrangement, much like her aunt's, would eventually produce. This transmission of accumulated wisdom passed informally from one generation of women to the next across decades of shared circumstance, represents perhaps the network's most lasting legacy, more durable in its way than any single friendship, surviving the deaths of its original members to continue shaping how younger women navigated similar arrangements well into the following generation. It was never written down as any formal guide. It existed instead in exactly the form it had always taken: conversation, example, the quiet accumulated evidence of lives built successfully within difficult constraint. The network's gatherings themselves evolved over the decades from purely social occasions into something closer to an informal institution, complete with its own gentle traditions. An annual gathering, held each June in whichever member's garden happened to be at its seasonal peak, became a fixture the women looked forward to with genuine anticipation rather than mere obligation. These gatherings grew, over the years, to include daughters and eventually granddaughters, some of whom would themselves in time come to understand the particular relevance this circle of women held for their own lives. Not every daughter welcomed into these gatherings would need the network's particular expertise, of course. Many married conventionally, into arrangements considerably warmer than their mothers had been, a hopeful sign of gradually shifting social and legal circumstances across the generations. But the network persisted regardless, its membership evolving to include women facing an increasingly varied range of marital difficulty, its core function remaining remarkably constant across the decades: mutual recognition, practical wisdom, and the simple, sustaining relief of being fully understood without needing to explain. Every January, a leather-bound ledger arrived from her attorney's office summarizing the previous year's trust performance, the quarterly allowances paid, the small adjustments made to household accounts. She reviewed this ledger each year with the same careful attention she brought to every other aspect of managing her household, and each year, the same quiet question surfaced somewhere beneath the columns of figures. What would her life have looked like had she chosen, all those years ago, to pursue a formal divorce instead of this careful, permanent middle arrangement? The honest answer, as she understood well by this point in her life, was considerably bleaker than the life she had actually built. A formal divorce, pursued under the laws of her era, would have required proving her husband's infidelity in open court, a proceeding that would have exposed both families to exactly the kind of scandal the separation agreement was specifically designed to avoid. Even a successful divorce would likely have left her with a settlement considerably less generous than the one she currently enjoyed, negotiated as it was under the shadow of public exposure rather than the relative privacy of a quiet legal arrangement. More significantly, a divorced woman of her era occupied a social position considerably more precarious than her own. Divorce, regardless of which party bore legal fault, carried a stigma that attached primarily to the woman, marking her as somehow diminished, no longer quite respectable, excluded from the invitations and social positions that had structured her entire adult life. The women's network described in the previous chapter, the hospital board work that gave such meaningful structure to her days, the standing within her extended family that allowed her to remain a central valued figure at every holiday gathering, all of this depended, in ways both subtle and profound, on her continued status as a legally married woman, however unconventional that marriage's daily reality actually was. This calculation, weighing the emotional cost of remaining legally bound to a marriage that provided almost none of what marriage traditionally promised against the social and financial devastation a formal divorce would likely have produced, was one that thousands of women in her position made, explicitly or implicitly, across this entire era. The deed of separation offered a genuine, if imperfect, third path, neither the full freedom of divorce nor the full illusion of a functioning marriage, but a carefully constructed middle ground that protected what could be protected while abandoning what could not realistically be saved. The financial architecture underlying this middle path deserves closer examination because it reveals just how carefully these arrangements were constructed to serve interest beyond the immediate emotional needs of either spouse. The trust established under her separation agreement was structured deliberately to survive her husband's eventual death, protected against claims from any other beneficiaries his estate might eventually include. This provision mattered enormously, given what everyone involved understood, even if no one stated it explicitly, about the likely continuation of his second household. Her attorney had insisted during the original negotiations on language specifically protecting her allowance from any future claims, a foresight that would prove genuinely significant decades later, when her husband's death triggered exactly the kind of complicated estate proceedings such careful language was designed to prevent. Without this protection, her position, despite decades of faithful adherence to every requirement the separation agreement placed upon her, might have been considerably less secure than it ultimately proved to be. The quarterly payments themselves, arriving with reliable regularity across more than 3 decades, funded not merely her household, but a life of genuine, if circumscribed, independence. She controlled this money entirely, a right not universally available to married women even in the more progressive legal environment of the later years of her marriage. She invested a portion of it, conservatively but with genuine engagement, developing over the years a reasonably sophisticated understanding of the securities markets that many of her male relatives would have been surprised to discover she possessed. This financial independence, however circumscribed by the broader circumstances that had produced it, offered her something considerably more valuable than simple comfort. It offered her the ability to make decisions about her household, her charitable commitments, eventually her own estate planning, entirely according to her own judgment, without requiring anyone else's permission or approval. In a life that had, in so many other respects, been shaped by decisions made on her behalf by others, this financial autonomy represented one of its few genuinely self-directed dimensions. It would be a mistake, however, to view this financial security as uncomplicated compensation for what the marriage itself had failed to provide. The money arrived, after all, precisely because the marriage had failed in the particular way it had, precisely because a husband who might otherwise have simply remained present, engaged, genuinely partnered in the daily texture of family life, had instead chosen a different arrangement, one that required, as a matter of legal and social necessity, exactly this kind of formal financial provision in its place. She understood this exchange clearly, even as she came to value the independence it provided. The allowance was not, in any meaningful sense, a gift. It was compensation, carefully calculated and legally formalized for the particular shape her marriage had taken. Payment, in the frankest possible terms, for her continued cooperation with an arrangement that served her husband's interests as much as, if not more than, her own. Understanding this did not diminish her gratitude for the security the arrangement provided. It simply kept that gratitude honest, unclouded by any illusion about what the money actually represented. As she grew older, and as her own children established their independent households, her relationship to this financial architecture shifted once more. She began, in her later years, directing an increasing portion of her allowance toward the causes she had spent decades supporting through her committee work. The hospital that had occupied so much of her time, a scholarship fund established in her own name for young women pursuing education, otherwise closed to them by their family's limited means. The money that had originally arrived as compensation for a marriage's failure became, in her hands, the foundation of a philanthropic legacy entirely her own. This transformation, from compensation to legacy, from payment for silence to foundation for genuine impact, represents perhaps the most hopeful thread running through this particular chapter of her story. The financial architecture that had originally been constructed to manage the practical consequences of a failed marriage became, over decades of careful stewardship, something considerably more meaningful, proof that even resources originating in disappointment and compromise could, in the right hands, be directed toward genuine and lasting good. The final entry in her personal ledger, recorded in the careful hand she had maintained her entire life, notes the establishment of this scholarship fund with a specific dollar amount and a brief description of its purpose. There is no mention, in this final entry, of the marriage that had originally made such resources available to her. By this point in her life, the connection between the two had become, in her own private accounting, almost entirely beside the point. What mattered was what she'd ultimately built with what circumstance had given her, a life, and eventually a legacy, entirely her own. It is worth considering too how this financial arrangement compared to what was available to women of more modest means facing similar marital difficulties during this same era. A woman without significant family wealth of her own, married to a husband who chose to establish a second household elsewhere, typically possessed almost none of the protections that the deed of separation provided our central figure. Without substantial family resources to fund independent legal representation, without property or trusts of her own to negotiate around, such a woman often had no realistic alternative to simply enduring her circumstances, dependent entirely on whatever support her husband chose, voluntarily, to continue providing. This disparity reveals an uncomfortable truth underlying the entire story told across this chapter and the ones preceding it. The relative security our central figure eventually built for herself was made possible not merely by her own considerable competence and determination, real as both those qualities were, but by the substantial family wealth that had funded her original dowry, retained her own attorney independent of her husband's family, and ultimately negotiated the careful financial protections that sustained her for the following 3 decades. Women without this foundation of independent wealth face circumstances considerably more precarious, with far fewer resources available to construct anything resembling the life she managed to build. This is not offered as a diminishment of her genuine accomplishment, but as necessary context for understanding it accurately. She built a remarkable life within her circumstances, certainly. The garden, the scholarship fund, the network of genuine friendship, the 2 children she raised with evident care and success. But she built this life atop a foundation of financial security that remained, throughout this entire era, available almost exclusively to women of her particular class, leaving countless other women facing similar marital abandonment with far fewer tools for constructing anything comparable. Her own awareness of this disparity grew more pronounced as she aged, and it shaped, directly, her eventual decision to direct so much of her later financial resources toward the scholarship fund specifically benefiting young women without significant family wealth of their own. In private correspondence from this period, she wrote explicitly about wanting to extend to women who would never have access to the particular protections her own marriage settlement had provided, at least some measure of the independence and opportunity that financial security had made possible in her own life. This motivation adds a further dimension to understanding her eventual philanthropic legacy, not simply an expression of general goodwill, though it was certainly that, but a specific deliberate response to her own clear-eyed understanding of how unevenly the protections she had benefited from were actually distributed across women of her broader era. The scholarship fund became, in this light, a kind of correction, however partial and however limited in its ultimate scope, for a system she had witnessed operating in radically different ways depending entirely on the wealth a woman happened to be born into or married into. The fund's early recipients, whose names survive in the careful record she maintained personally, rather than delegating entirely to the fund's eventual administrators, included women pursuing training as teachers, nurses, and, in a small number of cases that particularly pleased her, according to her own correspondence, the fledgling profession of social work, a field then emerging specifically to address the kinds of structural inequality she had spent decades observing first-hand within her own social circle, if from a considerably more privileged vantage point than the women that profession primarily aimed to serve. She corresponded personally with several of these early recipients, a practice that continued for the remainder of her life, and that several recipients later described, in their own recollections, as unexpectedly meaningful, not merely financial support, delivered impersonally through an administrator, but genuine interest from a woman who asked after their studies, celebrated their eventual graduations, and offered, on more than one occasion, practical career advice drawn from her own decades of navigating institutions like the hospital board that had not always welcomed women's full participation. This personal engagement with the fund's beneficiaries reveals something important about how she'd come, by this later stage of her life, to understand her own accumulated wealth and the particular history that had produced it. The money had originated in disappointment, compensation for a marriage that had failed to deliver what marriage traditionally promised. But in her hands, across the final decades of her life, that same money became something considerably more generative, a bridge extended deliberately and personally toward women who would otherwise have had no comparable path toward the kind of independence and opportunity she had, eventually and imperfectly, managed to construct for herself. Her attorney, reviewing the fund's structure with her in the final years before her death, once remarked that she had built effectively a second trust entirely of her own design, one that operated according to principles she herself had chosen, rather than terms negotiated on her behalf by lawyers representing competing family interests. She agreed with this characterization readily, noting, with the dry humour that had become characteristic of her later years, that it had taken her the better part of a lifetime to finally construct a financial arrangement that answered to no one's judgment but her own. By the time she reached her 65th year, the townhouse had grown quieter still, its 11 rooms now maintained by a staff reduced to 3, the great dining table set on most evenings for a household of one who no longer entertained quite as often as she once had. Her husband had died 4 years earlier, quietly, in the West Side apartment that had been, for the final 2 decades of his life, his primary residence in every sense but the legal one. His death had brought, alongside the ordinary grief of losing someone she had once, briefly, hoped to build a genuine life alongside, a peculiar kind of legal and social finality she had not fully anticipated. The separation agreement, which had governed the shape of her existence for over 3 decades, quietly retired itself upon his death, replaced by the more conventional provisions of widowhood. She was, for the first time since her wedding day, simply a widow, a status that carried its own social weight, but one considerably less complicated than the particular position she had occupied for so many years before. The obituary that ran in the city's papers described him, in the customary language of such notices, as survived by his beloved wife of 41 years. Reading this description, she felt something she had not entirely expected. Not anger exactly, and not simple sorrow, but a kind of weary recognition at how completely the public record continued to honour the fiction the separation agreement had always required her to maintain. 41 years. The number was, in its narrow legal sense, entirely accurate. It captured almost nothing of what those 41 years had actually contained. She attended the funeral, as the arrangement's final required appearance demanded, standing at the front of the church in appropriate mourning dress, receiving condolences from relatives and acquaintances who had no reason to question the sincerity of her grief, and her grief was, in its own complicated way, sincere, not for the marriage she had once hoped for, which had never actually materialized, but for the young man she had briefly glimpsed on her wedding day, before either of them fully understood what their lives together would actually become. The years following his death brought their own particular texture to her life. Freed from the calendar of required appearances that had structured so much of her adult existence, she found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, missing certain aspects of the performance she had spent decades perfecting. There was, she admitted to one of her remaining friends from the old network, a strange comfort in those 7 red ink dates each year, evidence, however manufactured, that she remained connected to a family, a lineage, a story larger than her own solitary household. Without those required appearances, her calendar reorganized itself entirely around the pursuits she had built genuinely and deliberately across the preceding decades. The hospital board, now chaired by her in recognition of nearly 30 years of dedicated service. The scholarship fund, which had by this point supported the education of over 40 young women who would otherwise have had no realistic path to the opportunities it provided. The garden matured now into something genuinely remarkable, occasionally open to the public for charitable tours that drew visitors from across the city. Her children, grown now with families of their own, visited regularly, bringing grandchildren whose presence filled the townhouse's quiet rooms with exactly the kind of warmth its original architecture had been designed to hold. She found, in these visits, a satisfaction that had eluded her for much of her adult life. The simple, uncomplicated pleasure of a family gathered together, without the careful management of appearances that had governed every previous family occasion she could remember. In her private journal, kept intermittently across the final decade of her life, she wrote with increasing candour about the marriage that had shaped so much of her existence. These later entries reveal a woman who had made, largely, an uneasy peace with the particular shape her life had taken. Not full forgiveness, not complete resolution, but something closer to clear-eyed acceptance, an acknowledgement of what had been lost alongside genuine pride in what she had nonetheless managed to build. One entry, written perhaps 2 years before her own death, offers what might be the most honest summary she ever recorded of her own experience. She wrote that she had spent the majority of her adult life married to a man she barely knew, in a house he rarely visited, performing a role that bore almost no resemblance to what she had imagined on her wedding day. And yet, she continued, she had also built within the considerable constraints of that arrangement a life she had come to value deeply, a garden, a scholarship fund, a network of genuine friendships, 2 children she had raised largely alone and of whom she remained unreservedly proud. This is perhaps the truest way to understand the entire arc of her story, and the stories of countless women who lived through similar circumstances during this era. Their marriages, examined purely on the terms the institution traditionally promised, largely failed to provide partnership, failed to provide companionship, failed to provide the warmth and mutual investment that marriage, in its ideal form, is supposed to offer. And yet, within and around that failure, these women built lives of genuine substance, genuine accomplishment, and, in many cases, genuine contentment. She died in her own bed, in the townhouse she had purchased with funds specified in a deed of separation signed decades earlier, surrounded by children and grandchildren who understood, by this point in the family's history, at least the broad outlines of what her marriage had actually been. Her funeral drew a considerably larger gathering than her husband's had, a fact that several attendees privately remarked upon, though none said so within earshot of the family. The scholarship fund she established continued for decades after her death, eventually supporting hundreds of young women whose names she would never know, whose lives she nonetheless meaningfully shaped through resources that had originated so many years earlier in a marriage's quiet and largely unspoken failure. There is a particular justice in this legacy, however unintended its origins. Money that had once represented compensation for a life half-lived, transformed, through decades of careful stewardship, into genuine opportunity for women who would never know her name. Her garden too outlived her, maintained for a further generation by the family before the townhouse was eventually sold and the grounds redeveloped, as so many grand properties of this era eventually were. But for the decades it flourished under her care, It stood as perhaps the most complete physical expression of what she had actually built with the life circumstance had given her, something planted deliberately, tended patiently, and allowed, across enough seasons, to grow into something genuinely and unambiguously beautiful. In the final years of her life, confined increasingly to the house by the ordinary limitations of advancing age, she took to spending her afternoons in the second-floor sitting room that had, across so many decades, witnessed the fuller arc of her adult life, the same room where she had once received the lawyer who explained the terms of her separation agreement, the same room where she had hosted countless meetings of the hospital board, the same room where her children had once gathered as young adults to discuss for the first time openly the true shape of their family's history. A niece who visited regularly during these final years later recorded, in a memoir written decades afterward, her aunt's particular manner of reflecting on her own life during these quiet afternoons, not with bitterness, the niece was careful to note, but with a kind of clear, unsentimental honesty that the niece found remarkable given the considerable disappointments her aunt's life had, by any objective measure, actually contained. She spoke of her marriage rarely, and when she did, she spoke of it as one might speak of a difficult employer or an unreliable business partner. A significant fact of her life, certainly, but not the defining one. What she spoke of more readily, according to this same memoir, were the things she had built despite the marriage's failures rather than because of them. The particular satisfaction of watching a scholarship recipient graduate and enter a profession that would have been entirely closed to her without that support. The quiet pride of a garden that strangers now travelled across the city to see during its annual charitable openings. The considerable comfort of grandchildren who visited not out of obligation but out of genuine affection, drawn to a grandmother whose household had become, over the decades, a place of warmth rather than simply duty. This is, perhaps, the most important lesson her particular story offers, and the lesson this longer chronicle has attempted to trace across every chapter that preceded this one. The marriages examined throughout this story were, by almost any conventional measure, failures, arrangements that provided legal status and financial security, while abandoning nearly everything else the institution of marriage has traditionally promised to deliver. And yet the women who lived within these failed arrangements were not themselves failures. They were women who took circumstances they had not chosen, and, through decades of patient, deliberate effort, built lives of genuine substance within them. She died on a quiet morning in early spring, in the same bedroom she had occupied for over 50 years, with her daughter beside her and her son arriving from out of town just hours too late to say a final goodbye in person, though he had spoken with her by telephone the previous evening, a conversation her daughter later described as warm, unhurried, and entirely without regret. Her last recorded words, according to her daughter's account, concerned instructions for the garden's spring planting, a final characteristic act of careful, deliberate attention to something she had spent decades building with her own patient hands. In the weeks following her death, as her children and grandchildren sorted through the considerable accumulated papers of a long and carefully documented life, they discovered, tucked among household accounts and correspondence, a small collection of items she had evidently kept close throughout the decades, the creased photograph from her wedding day, several letters from the women in her old network, a pressed flower from what appeared to be an early planting in the garden she had designed herself, and a single page, undated, containing only a brief, handwritten passage that seemed to summarize, in her own words, the fuller philosophy she had arrived at across a lifetime of navigating circumstances she had not chosen. The passage, preserved now among the family's papers, reads simply, "A life is not undone by the parts that disappoint you. It is built patiently from whatever remains once you have stopped waiting for the parts that were never going to arrive." This sentence, brief and unadorned as it is, offers perhaps the clearest single window available into how she came, across so many decades, to understand her own remarkable and complicated story. Not as a tragedy to be mourned, and not as a triumph to be celebrated uncritically, but simply as a life, fully lived, within whatever boundaries circumstance had drawn around it. Her grandchildren, and eventually their own children, would grow up knowing this story only in fragments. A family legend about a great-grandmother's unusual marriage, softened by time into something closer to an interesting curiosity than the daily reality of difficulty and quiet determination it had actually represented. This softening, too, is perhaps fitting, the sharpest edges of any difficult life tend to smooth across enough generations into something gentler, more easily held. What remains, in the end, is simply the garden that still, in some diminished form, occupies part of what was once her property, and the scholarship fund that continues more than a century later to carry her name into lives she never had the chance to personally know. There is one final letter worth including here, written by her daughter some months after the funeral, addressed to no one in particular, found among the daughter's own papers after her own death decades later. It reads, in part, as an attempt to summarize what her mother's life had ultimately meant, and it closes with a sentence that seems, in retrospect, to capture the entire arc traced across this longer story. "My mother," the daughter wrote, "was never given the marriage she deserved. She built instead a life she deserved, out of whatever was left. I have spent my own life trying to understand how she managed it, and I am not certain I ever fully will, but I know that she did. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well." The kitchen is quiet again. The coffee cup, long since emptied, sits rinsed and drying on the rack beside the sink. The stack of envelopes has been sealed, stamped and set by the front door, ready for morning collection. The radio upstairs has gone silent, its voice finished reading whatever news it had to offer. Outside, the street is fully woken now, the pale grey light of early morning giving way to something warmer. Somewhere in that house, in countless houses very much like it, women moved through lives that were never quite what they had imagined on their wedding day and built within the space that remained something worth calling a life all the same. The desk lamp in the study is the last light left burning. It will be switched off soon, the way it has been switched off every night for as long as anyone in the house can remember. The world outside continues on, indifferent and unhurried. Let it. There is nowhere else you need to be. Let your eyes close and let the quiet of that kitchen, that street, that single remaining light carry you the rest of the way into sleep. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments. And before you go, if you were one of these women, quietly maintaining a marriage that existed mostly on paper, what do you think would have gotten you through it?